Part 1, Chapter 6. Fiat Justitia, Ruat Coelum. Quote, the Bassa was carried in chains to Constantinople, and his name was mentioned no more. End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 24. Fragments of a correspondence exchanged at the end of March, 1813. From Miss Letitia Bentley to the Honorable Juliana Forrest. Northover, March 24th. My dearest Juliana, when she pays a promised visit to Northover next month, will, I feel sure, sadly miss one agreeable presence from our little gatherings and one very pleasing voice from our musical diversions, and she will be distressed at the reason for it. Captain de Sablière, sad to say, has been sent as a prisoner to the depot at Norman Cross in Huntingdonshire for breaking his parole under some mysterious circumstances, which Mr. Bannister will not reveal, but which are given out to be particularly discreditable. Your Letitia cannot believe his latter charge, nor Papa either, who says, however, that since Mr. Bannister is a perfectly honest man, and was formerly very well disposed towards Monsieur de Sablière, it is clear that the latter must have committed some breach of the parole regulations. For it is said that he had all but completed his arrangements for escaping. If that should be so, how were we deceived in him? But no, I do not, will not, credit it. Is it true that everything in London at present is à la Russe, and have you, my Juliana, observed any real elegance wearing the hair in evening or opera dress, flat on the side, and in waved curls in front, and confined in full curls at the back of the head, with an apparent stray ringlet falling on one shoulder, as I've read is the mode? Oh, pray be sure to bring back all the fashionable intelligence of this country. From the Honorable Juliana Forrest to Sir Francis Mulholland, Bart. Grosvenor Square, March 27, 1813. My dear Francis, I am greatly distressed to hear that Monsieur de Sablière has been sent to Norman Cross Prison for breaking his parole, since I cannot but connect it with his coming to my rescue in Folly Copse, as I described to you. Oh, but surely he could not have been convicted for an act so plainly one of chivalry. Yet, still less can I imagine his having transgressed the obligations of his parole. I am deeply uneasy about the whole matter, and implore you to relieve my anxiety. From Sir Francis Mulholland to the Honourable Juliana Forrest. Mulholland Park, March 30th, 1813. My dearest Juliana, sorry as I am to lower the high opinion in which I know you hold Monsieur de Sablière, I must, as you urge me, tell you the truth of the matter, or at least so much of it as is known to me. It was not his having gone to your assistance in Folly Copse, which could, in the circumstances, easily have been overlooked, that was the cause of his committal to Norman Cross, but a much more serious happening, which came to light immediately after your departure. Bannister refuses to reveal the circumstances, but, as far as I can gather, they must be very black. It is generally understood that the Frenchmen had all but completed the arrangements for his escape when they were discovered. I look back, my dear Juliana, with regret to the thought that we could ever have had a difference of opinion over so unworthy an object, nor do I wish to lay stress on the fact that it is not I who am proved wrong by the sequel. You will, I'm sure, be glad now that you gave me your promise that last evening, not to say a word to anyone of your encounter with a tramp. As much as I, myself, will you wish to preserve your name from association with that of a man who has violated his word of honor. You cannot guess how I count the days till your arrival at Northover, where, I hope, Miss Bentley will not find me too assiduous a visitor. Spring was a fact, not a promise, when Juliana came back to Wanfield, and Northover welcomed her with pear and apple blossom. As for Letitia, she and her dearest friend might have been parted a year instead of a month, so rapturous was her greeting. Sir Francis Mulholland's also was everything which a young lady could desire of her swain, and when he paid his first visit to Northover, the day after Juliana's arrival, Letitia thought him strangely improved in manner, and commented upon the fact to her papa, who opined that somehow or other Miss Juliana, when last at Wanfield, had given him a fright, and that he was walking delicately in consequence. It was true that Sir Francis had need to walk delicately, but it was more on account of his own actions than of Juliana's. He had been, he was still, playing a terribly risky game, but he had taken precautions. When, on returning to Mulholland Park that evening after laying information against de Sablière, he heard from Juliana herself the reason of the Frenchman's rushing up to the copse, he was greatly chagrined, both by the check to his newly formed plan of getting rid of him, and by Juliana's openly displayed gratitude and admiration for his timely succor. On top of this, for it did not take much to bring out what Miss Juliana had always half intended that he should know, and for his own good, came the stunning intelligence that she had previously met her rescuer by appointment at the bridge. And the shock convinced her betrothed that his apprehensions were far from being idle. Drastic action was absolutely necessary now. But he behaved to the transgressor with a circumspection of which he was afterwards to reap the reward. By the exercise of really praiseworthy self-control, he contrived to avoid making a scene over this mortifying discovery, confining himself to pointing out the patent results of having returned home unescorted. And Juliana, worked upon by this moderation, as she never would have been by reproaches, admitted to having been at least foolish, and gave her affianced without much difficulty the promise that she would not only abstain from mentioning the clandestine meeting, even to Letitia Bentley, but that the tramp episode also should be buried in deep oblivion. For she was sufficiently ashamed now of the one, and shaken by the other, to agree that it was not desirable to have her name coupled in Wanfield gossip with her rescuers, since blame might thereby accrue to Sir Francis, who certainly could not with justice be accused of having willingly let her return home unescorted. After this interview, Sir Francis spent a good part of the night weighing the risks of the all too tempting course open to him, and with this revelation of Juliana's self-will before him, decided to take them. It was quite useless for her to declare, as she had done, that the Frenchman had not attempted in the slightest degree to make love to her, or that he was not jointly responsible, at the very least, for the meeting. Sir Francis simply did not believe her. Yet, without Juliana's early departure next morning, he could hardly have carried through his unscrupulous design. His one really uncomfortable moment in Bannister's office was when his victim threatened to call a witness of Miss Forrest's whereabouts. But, since he did not do it, and Juliana had said nothing of anyone having seen them together, Sir Francis decided that this threat was mere bravado. Bannister's mouth he subsequently shut by the very reasonable-sounding request that he would abstain from mentioning in Wanfield the ground on which de Sablière had been sent to prison, because Miss Forrest's name had been brought, though unjustifiably, into the affair. The one risk against which it was impossible to guard was that of the Frenchman's writing from prison to Juliana in person and asking her to corroborate his challenged statement. Indeed, it was not until Sir Francis received Juliana's own letter of inquiry that he knew for certain that this had not happened. After that, it remained only to provide against Juliana herself, making inconvenient investigations at Wanfield on her return. And this, too, the ingenious gentleman had devised a means of preventing. He put his plan into practice when, on the third day of her stay at Northover, she drove, with Letitia Bentley, to call on Mrs. Mulholland, bearing with her for the old lady a large shawl of Siberian wool, edged with sealskin. Juliana's future home, which stood upon an eminence, had been Grecianized and stuccoed over at the end of the last century, and one looked from between an intolerable number of pillars down a good mile or so of park-like distance, which included fallow deer. The other two ladies tactfully remaining in the drawing room, from which, indeed, Mrs. Mulholland rarely stirred. Sir Francis drew his betrothed through the pillars onto the terrace. "We have very much improved the view from here since last I saw it, Francis," remarked Juliana with appreciation. "Oh, I'm so glad that you think so, my dearest. I hoped it would please you." He took her hand and carried it tenderly to his lips. He was today much more the man who had swept her off her feet in January, strong, self-confident, handsome, smiling, yet lover-like. And as she looked at him, Juliana began to feel that she had been unduly hard on him that afternoon in the Chinese room at Northover, and that it was she, perhaps, who had exaggerated his care and devotion into jealousy. He had behaved so well over the test, Folly Bridge. But what of her companion that day by the stream? Her face clouded. Sir Francis, watching it, felt that he knew on what subject she was about to embark, and welcomed the topic, for the finishing stroke had to be put to his own security. He was right. "Francis," she said, in a troubled voice, sinking down on a stone seat which faced the view, "and this sad business about Monsieur de Sablière. I cannot believe what is said of him. I want to go into the matter more fully. I want you to institute inquiries. I'm certain there's a mistake somewhere. Yet, you told me in your letter that Mr. Bannister will not say a word, and Mr. Bentley, I find, knows nothing, distressed as he is about the affair. And you know nothing. But I'm determined to find out. You must recognize that gratitude alone." "Oh yes, my dear, I recognize that, and I quite agree with you," said the follower of Machiavelli. "But since I wrote to you, Mr. Bannister has told me the story, the whole story. My lips, however, are unfortunately sealed, even to you, Juliana, for it involves the honor of someone of consequence." He was not referring to himself, but to some entirely mythical personage. No good to de Sablière, I assure you, could come of investigation, and it would only bring shame on this other person. If he succeeded, that is. So I implore you, my dear one, to give up the attempt. This man, the lover of 4 months ago, she would listen to, and so she looked at him mutely, impressed, and with no thought of doubting what he said. "You realize, Juliana, do you not," he went on gently, "that de Sablière, who was undoubtedly a favourite of Bannister's and had received privileges from him, would never have been sent off to a prison without strong proof of his guilt. And you know the story," said Juliana slowly, looking at him as if she only wished she could read it in his face. "Can you not assure me, at least, that it was not very disgraceful, from Monsieur de Sablière's point of view?" How she fought for him, but the shade of Machiavelli inspired Sir Francis to his best stroke. Instead of replying, in the style of Mr. Ramage, that it was disgraceful, scandalous and disgraceful, he said temperately, "Oh, I suppose, Juliana, that one must make allowances for a poor devil of a prisoner who is tempted to regain his liberty at the price of his honor. Perhaps we, who are perfectly free, have not the right to blame him very much." Juliana Forrest sighed and looked away at the long vista, and her betrothed looked at her. The doubt had already begun to work, perhaps. If she thought the fellow had really behaved ill, he believed she had too much feeling for him. Curse him, ever to set to work to unveil the details of his misconduct. "And the other man involved?" asked Juliana after a moment. Sir Francis slightly smiled and shook his head. "Oh, I've given my word to Bannister that not a syllable shall pass my lips. You, surely, are not the woman to tempt me to break it, my Juliana. Or will you look at the new shrubbery before we go in again?" She assented, and in the shrubbery allowed him to kiss her. Did you have an agreeable talk in the garden, Francis, you and dear Juliana? Quavered old Mrs. Mulholland when, some half-hour later, her son returned from handing the ladies into the Northover barouche. Oh, I thought the dear girl looked a little sad when she came in, but you seemed in such spirits that I dare say I was mistaken, and I had mislaid my spectacles. Oh dear, Letitia Bentley and I had such an interesting discussion about your work while you were out there. We had a very satisfactory conversation indeed, replied he, and she quite approves of the new shrubbery. Oh dear, Juliana has very good taste, rippled on Mrs. Mulholland, gazing fondly at her new acquisition. How this exquisite shawl, so warm, too. I wished to ask her if she liked my new cap, but I feared that it might be crooked, and thought it better not to draw her attention to it. Oh, it is certainly crooked now, observed Sir Francis. I will put it straight for you. He did so, and gave his mother a kiss, a somewhat rare event. But when a man has just brought off a very delicate stroke of diplomacy, he is naturally rather expansive. So Juliana became once more a part of the merry little gatherings at Northover, which, as the weather grew warmer, tended to overflow from the drawing-room and the pianoforte into the spring-decked garden. Another French officer or two had superseded Rowl de Sablière, whose name was practically never heard there now, for the discussion of the crop of black surmises raised by Mr. Bannister's determined refusal to give even a hint of why he had been sent to prison was dying down by this time. Yet Juliana had declared to her friend that she did not believe one of the damaging conjectures which were repeated to her, had even declared it once or twice vehemently in public, after which she never spoke of the young Frenchman again. Only Letitia noticed that on the day when young Mr. Curtis from Stoneleigh Manor sang "Since First I Saw Your Face" in her hearing, she made an excuse and slipped from the room. But inwardly, Juliana still told herself that she never doubted there had been some misunderstanding. Indeed, she could not, illogically perhaps, quite rid herself of the feeling that after all the rush to her succor had had something to do with the business. But she could do nothing now, after what Francis had said. And perhaps there had come to Mr. Rowl some sudden violent temptation. He had said that day something significant about his inactivity. Francis, who knew the truth, had suggested that he should not be blamed overmuch. That was so generous of Francis, so different from Mr. Ramage, who on the same theme was intolerable. Knowing the sentiments of Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne on the subject of parole breaking, she was careful never to mention Raoul's name before him, but the topic of his disgrace did come up one day in the Comte's presence, and he behaved in an unexpected and inscrutable manner, puzzling her not so much by what he said as by what he did not say. Meanwhile, there began to be talk of a wedding, sometime in the autumn. It was to take place from her father's house in Grosvenor Square. Every time she went over to Mulholland Park, Mrs. Mulholland reconsulted her about her headgear for that occasion, and Juliana and her betrothed smiled together over her anxiety in the new communion which seemed to have sprung up between them. The pear blossom fell. The apple blossom was at its zenith. In a certain wood not far from Wanfield were reported to be great quantities of bluebells, and there, on the 28th of April, the young people proposed to partake of a cold collation. Sir Francis Mulholland, on horseback, and Mr. Bentley were also to be of the party. But early on the morning of this expedition, Juliana, who was without her maid, discovered that the dress which she designed to wear on this occasion was in need of a new tucker, and since there was plenty of time to supply this want, she and Letitia ordered the barouche early and drove into Wanfield. Just before they alighted from the carriage in the High Street, Juliana observed a French naval officer salute Miss Bentley and inquired who it was. "It was Lieutenant Lamott," replied her friend. "I've met him at the Curtises. He lodges with Miss Hitchings, where poor Monsieur de Sablière used to lodge." At the mention of that name, Juliana's face had clouded, but she said nothing, and in another moment they were descending at the door of the linen draper's shop. But as they were on the point of entering, they heard hasty steps, and turning, saw the young Frenchman hurrying towards them. "Miss Bentley," said he, in his own language, "I have a commission. That is, if this lady is Miss Forrest, as I think, and if you will be so obliging as to present me. The commission was entrusted to me by my comrade, Captain de Sablière, before his departure." Juliana colored. Lieutenant Lamothe was presented, and thereupon addressed her directly. "Captain de Sablière entrusted me, mademoiselle, with an English book to return to you. If it is not improper, would you allow me to discharge the commission now, provided it would not be burdening you, for Mulholland Park is out of bounds for me." "But Miss Forrest is not," began Laetitia, and was too much arrested by the expression on a friend's face to finish. "I lent Monsieur de Sablière no book, monsieur," said Juliana slowly. "Oh, but yes, mademoiselle, you have forgotten your kindness. Rasselas, by the Dr. Johnson. If you will allow me, as I see that you are on the point of entering the shop, I will run meanwhile to my lodgings and get it, and wait for you here." "Oh, do, pray," said Juliana. She was looking oddly grave and discomposed, and in the shop paid but small attention to the choice of a tucker. When they emerged, there was the young man awaiting them. "This is the book, mademoiselle. When Captain de Sablière came out of jail, he was allowed a short time in his room to get together his effects, and he charged me with it. I was to give it to you in person, with the expression of his regrets that in so short a time he had not been able to finish reading it." Juliana, now colouring deeply, took the book. Why had Mr. Rowl returned it? She had given it to him to keep. He knew that. It surely was not possible that he felt himself unworthy. "I suppose," she said, falteringly, "that Monsieur de Sablière was not allowed to take his possessions with him to Norman Cross." "Oh yes, mademoiselle, he took what he had. Oh, it is true it was not much. I think this book, being your property, was the only thing he left behind. And he charged me most particularly to return it to you in person at the first opportunity." Juliana looked down at the little calf-bound volume, and was back nearly 6 weeks in time, and heard the stream ripple again, and the thrush call, which he who had been with her then could hear no longer. And that was all the message. Yes, mademoiselle, that he regretted he could not finish the book in the time. In effect, said Monsieur Lamothe, as if to excuse his compatriot. He had only that one evening before he was sent to the jail here. "Which evening was that?" asked Juliana quickly. "The evening when, coming to sup with him, I found him deep in that book, and he told me that he had only just received it that afternoon. I remember observing the title, a strange one, and when I saw him again 3 days afterwards, under guard, he gave me the book for you, as I say." He did not say then why he was being sent to Norman Cross?" asked Juliana with a beating heart. "No, mademoiselle. But I suppose it was for the same cause which had led Mr. Bannister to put him practically under arrest on the evening to which I was referring. Mr. Bannister had been to see him, and bade him not to leave the house. Captain de Sablière did not tell me why, only that it was on account of some misunderstanding which would be put right in the morning. Oh, certainly. It did not trouble him much that evening, said Lieutenant Lamothe reminiscently. But yet, in the morning it was not put right. Folly Copse, her rescue, Rasselas had been there too. Was it Folly Copse which had ruined him? Oh, monsieur, if you could but tell me which evening that was. Oh, forgive me, but the exact date is so important. I know something which might help Monsieur de Sablière to clear himself, for I've never believed that he broke his parole. Nor I, mademoiselle, said the sailor simply. And I do not need any effort to remember the date as it happens. It was on the evening before the birthday of the King of Rowl that de Sabliac was confined to the house. Friday, the 19th of March. The birthday itself, which is on the 20th, and the poor de Sabliac spent in jail, but for a certain reason he had celebrated it the evening before, on the 19th. I'm quite certain of that, mademoiselle. The 19th of March, the Friday, the same day, said Juliana, apparently speaking to herself. So, it had to do with that. It was not something which was discovered later. Thank you, monsieur, she added, and forgive my questions. Your friend has had a great injustice done him. It must be put right at once. Her voice was firm, but she was very pale. Lieutenant Lamott bowed and took himself off. Letitia put her arm through her friend's. What is the matter, dearest Juliana? She asked anxiously. You're unwell. Let us go back into the shop. But Juliana shook her head. Clutching Rasselas to her, she said solemnly, Letty, I shall never play with fire again. It is other people who get burned. I'm sure it's all my fault that he was sent to prison. But if it is, I'm going to repair it. Please desire your coachman to set us down at Mr. Bannister's office without delay. 3/4 of an hour later, the barouche was bearing back to Northover two very different damsels, not only from those who had set out upon that brief shopping expedition, but even from those who had entered the office of the astonished agent to set right an injustice, and had discovered and fired a mine. Letitia was frankly crying, and Juliana, shivering with a strange inner cold, sat staring straight before her. It had needed only her initial remark to Mr. Bannister. I fear it is on account of the service he rendered me that day in Folly Court that Monsieur de Sabliac got into difficulties with you. To bring down like a pack of cards all Sir Francis Mulholland's elaborate edifice of lies. But the effect of the fall on Bannister and themselves had been like that of a landslide. As they came in sight of the gates of Northover, Letitia dabbed at her eyes. Oh, Juliana, what shall we do? We cannot go to the wood. At least I feel too wretched. And what will Papa and everybody say if we do not? Well, I am going to the wood, responded Juliana firmly. I want to see Sir Francis at once. He joins us there, you remember. And you must come, Letitia, because you must, if necessary, contrive an opportunity for me to see him alone. Do you understand? Now pull your bonnet down a little, and perhaps no one will observe that you've been crying. Her resolution and self-command amazed the weaker spirit, who made haste, however, to obey her. Fortunately, they were so late. Mr. Bentley was already waiting on the doorstep, and 2 other carriages full of laughter and expostulations were in the drive. That there was no time for anyone to notice this composure, and if the 2 young men who drove with the just returned ladies observed anything unusual, they had perforce to keep their speculations to themselves. The bluebells were even bluer and more numerous than had been expected. The collation was voted excellent, the weather perfect. But Sir Francis Mulholland, if no one else, noticed that his bride-to-be looked pale and distrayed, and himself made the opportunity she wished for by suggesting, soon after the company had risen from their cold chicken and ham, that they should take a stroll to see more bluebells. Juliana assented, but almost inaudibly, and she did not take his proffered arm. Side by side, they walked away from the others. "Oh, I'm alarmed about you today, my love," observed Sir Francis solicitously as they went. "You are so pale. You tired yourself, I fear, by going into Wanfield, as I hear you did this morning." The moment had come, so soon. Speech was not needed. Juliana fixed her eyes on the stump of a tree, and the words came out slowly and heavily. "Yes, I had a great shock in Wanfield this morning. I do not imagine that, however long I live, I shall ever receive a greater. The color left her lover's face, too. "Or what were you doing in Wanfield?" he asked uneasily. "I went to Mr. Bannister's office." She heard him give an inarticulate exclamation. "I do not need to tell you what I learned there. What an incredible story of deceit, of mean revenge, came out." She turned her beautiful, accusing eyes on him. Francis, how could you do it? How could you descend to such inexpressible baseness?" "Oh, because you drove me to it," he cried wildly. "You scorned my entreaties, my warnings. And what for your own deceit? After your meeting him like that at Folly Bridge, I had to get rid of him. And I did nothing so very blameworthy, after all. Norman Cross is the best of the war prisons, and he was a prisoner in any case. It cannot have done him much harm. If you had listened to me..." The inward cold grew and spread, till Juliana's very heart seemed frozen with disgust. "Oh, then, if I can drive you to such an act as knowingly to take away an innocent man's honor, and to say that you have not hurt him, and two such monstrous lies to cover it, it is my duty as well as my wish to sever our relationship." And she slipped the ruby from her finger. "But pray take back your ring, for our engagement is at an end." He would not take it, and finally it dropped between them among the croziers of the young firm. He blustered, he raved, he pleaded, he even went on his knees to her among the brackens and the bluebells. "Oh, Juliana, have mercy. It was because I loved you so. I'll do anything. I'll retract what I said. Write to Norman Cross. For Mr. Bannister is already doing that." Sir Francis got to his feet. His face was patched and chalky. "Oh, I shall be ruined if this gets about." She surveyed him with deeper contempt. "And what of the man you have ruined?" "Oh, it can be undone, Juliana. I swear I'll reinstate him, whatever it costs." "Oh, you don't know how you madden me. Oh, for God's sake, think better of it. And put that ring on again, and I will never be jealous of you again in my life. Oh, where is the ring?" He stooped and began to fumble with shaking hands among the dead leaves and sand. "Oh, jealous!" exclaimed Juliana. "Oh, it is the lies, the subterfuges, the chain of subterfuges. Why, I should never be able to believe a word you said to me as long as I lived. And once I thought, oh, Francis. The tears came over her own lost happiness and the ideal figure she had been rebuilding on a foundation of mud. And for the sake of what she had once thought him, she promised, before she left him, that in the rehabilitation of his victim he should be spared as much as possible, that she would ask Mr. Bannister to say locally that there had been a mistake, misunderstandings, anything to cover his disgraceful conduct. For she, too, felt humiliated to the dust. And finally she went away from him, rather stumblingly, and a little later was found by Mr. Bentley crying at the foot of an oak tree, and that good friend, after letting her finish on his shoulder, had the carriage brought up and sent her home alone with Letitia on the plea of sudden illness. But the ruby ring, after exercising the wits of a number of ants and beetles, was found next year by Zachary Miller as he was putting a ferret down a rabbit hole, and cautiously disposed of at a distance, contributed not a little towards his marriage and the consequent begetting of a number of assistants and successors to carry on his activities in the Mulholland woods and elsewhere. Part 2. The Cost of a Win. Chapter 1. Forgotten? Quote, "It was divided into many squares or courts, according to the rank of those for whom they were designed. This house was built as if Suspicion herself had dictated the plan." End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 1. The mild blue sky was covered with the most delightful little fleecy clouds in motion. Rowl de Sablière, his head tilted back against the 8-feet-high palisade of the officers' enclosure at Norman Cross, watched them rather abstractedly. One seemed to be outstripping the others. He wondered how long it would take to traverse the great camp, and what it saw as it sailed over the heads of more than 5,000 prisoners. He knew pretty well, although, as an officer, he was confined to one small section of the town. For Norman Cross Depot, though set in the middle of fields, was almost a town. For a moment or two, Rowl idly imagined himself voyaging on the cloud over Yaxley or Stilton barracks, and the prison was rich in these three names. Now, he was poised above the octagonal wooden blockhouse in the center, with its projecting guns dominating each of the 4 courts, or airing grounds, which so symmetrically surrounded it. Each court a couple of acres in extent, and each containing 4 blocks of wooden buildings placed side by side at one of the outer edges. Every block was calculated to hold 500 men, but in the northeastern court, 3 had been taken over as a hospital, and, of those in the southeastern, the endmost facing east was the officers' prison, in the small separate enclosure of which the imaginary voyager sat at this moment. The 2 English militia regiments on guard were quartered outside the walls altogether. Rowl and his cloud would, he knew, see a good deal of activity going on in those 42 acres, and more especially in the 22 of the prison proper. There misery and cheerfulness, improvidence and industry jostled each other daily, for while some of the prisoners persistently gambled away not only their clothes and their bedding, but even their rations, others turned out little articles of beautiful workmanship in straw, bone, or paper, of which they were able to dispose at the market regularly held at the eastern gate. One object alone they might not legally manufacture and sell: straw plat, so that highly paid commodity was generally smuggled out by soldier accomplices. It was Saturday, the 1st of May, and Rowl had now been for nearly 6 weeks a member of this captive population. His immediate companions, with a very few exceptions, were all broke paroles, like himself. Rowl had come by now, on the surface, almost to class himself as one, but underneath there was still the same indignant repudiation of the stigma. At first he had kept somewhat aloof from the other officers, until he saw that his attitude was resented, until he was, in fact, asked rather roughly what he had to give himself airs about, and had bitterly put the same question to himself. For the first month at Norman Cross, he had been sustained by the hope that when Miss Forrest returned to Wanfield, she would discover his absence, realize her share in the disaster which had befallen him, and set about having the injustice righted. Even if she had told the untruth attributed to her, surely, when she discovered what it had involved for him. In his very uncomfortable and depressing detention in the lockup at Wanfield, he had been strongly visited by the temptation to write directly to her, and ask her whether she had declared that she had returned from Northover by the high road. But that would have been to force her hand. It was practically begging her to save him at whatever cost to herself, and it was of small use to be quixotic, if he had been quixotic, in the semi-publicity of Mr. Bannister's office, if, at the first taste of the consequences of his attitude, he was going to cry for mercy. So, the letter was never written, though another one was. But, though he would not put pressure upon her, Mr. Rowl might legitimately hope that Miss Forrest would, of her own free will, take some action on his behalf. Yet the days stole on, monotonous and unpleasant, and nothing happened. He was forgotten, just one more broke parole. Rowl was not, however, of the temper to spend his time idly brooding over his situation, and from the first moment of his entry into Norman Cross, his dominant idea had been how to get out again. And at last, after weeks of planning, there seemed a chance of realizing this ambition. It was true that in the 16 years of its existence as a war prison, for which it had been specially built, very few captives had succeeded in escaping from the depot. But chance had thrown Rowl into close contact with two others as determined as himself to get away. A certain Lieutenant Clary of the 26th of the line, and a Captain Dumont, commander of a Saint-Malo privateer, the Indienne. The shortage of accommodation in the officers' quarters at the moment of his arrival had caused Rowl to be thrust at night into the cupboard. It was scarcely more, which was inhabited by these two men, and in this proximity was hatched the scheme to which that very proximity had given rise. The first problem was that of procuring 3 suits of civilian clothes. This, with the greatest difficulty, they had succeeded in doing. The next was that of getting undiscovered out of Caserne number 8, the officers' block. Their tiny sleeping apartment had no proper window, but there was a ventilator in the roof, and this could be gained by an active young man assisted by his friends, and the same young man, at the cost of abrasions, could just squeeze himself through it and enlarge the exit by removing portions from outside. For the last 3 nights, Rowl had been working away at this task, and on Monday, the 3 adventurers counted upon scrambling out of this aperture, and then climbing down in the dark as best they could into the enclosure. They had already contrived to bore a few small holes in the high stockade, and into these, when the moment came, they intended to thrust some long nails to give them a foothold. But since it was out of their power previously to approach and prepare the great brick wall which surrounded the prison, they had to trust to aid from its other side. Cautious negotiations, conducted by the English-speaking Rowl, with a venal sentry of the West Kent militia, then on duty there, had resulted in the agreement that on the Monday night, the latter, being on guard outside near the south gate, should throw a rope over the wall, fastening it to some projection or other at its foot. Once over, and if they had the luck not to be seen by a sentry on the farther side, the fugitives could easily find their way to the Peterborough Road, which practically bordered the camp on the south. Thereafter, trusting to their wits, they must make either for the shores of the Wash or for the northern coast of Norfolk. They had a rather pathetic faith that, once arrived at the sea, Dumont, as a master mariner, would find some means of conveying them over that element. Rowl's cloud was gone now, melted into the blue, but that did not grieve him, for he had already forgotten about his aerial journey. A young man a few years his senior had detached himself from the groups strolling about the enclosure, and was coming towards him in a purposely nonchalant manner. It was Lieutenant Clary. He sat down on the bench by his fellow conspirator, who affected to take little notice of his arrival. "How you look just now, as if you were trying to learn the stars by daylight," observed the newcomer jestingly, and then, lowering his voice, "I expect they're all we shall have to steer by. I can't get hold of a compass anywhere." Rowl just glanced at him, without removing his head from its resting place against the stockade. "For the question is rather whether Dumont has succeeded in getting that map," he returned, equally low. For, as yet, they had nothing of that nature to guide them on their way to the coast, though they had for some days been trying to buy a smuggled map from a fellow prisoner. Yet, map or no map, we must start on Monday, because of Marvin's being on sentry duty that night. His next turn is 10 days later, and by that time the moon will be full. "Well, Dumont knows the canals, of course," said Clary doubtfully, "because he was brought by water from Lynn. But we cannot use them except as rough guides. It would not do to follow them closely." "Oh, I expect he will succeed in getting the map out of Parisot in the end," observed Rowl. "And Parisot never intended to use it himself, and, fortunately for us, Dumont is pretty flush of cash." "Yes, the old pirate. I think," said Lieutenant Clary, "that when I reach France, I shall resign my commission and ship on board a privateer." "Well, talking of privateers, I hear that some of the men in Caserne number 4, who are mostly sailors and privateersmen, are getting rather out of hand, and Captain Hanwell has stopped the whole block from selling their ware at the market next week. As a consequence, more unruliness, and he threatens to get the worst black sheep sent to the hogs. "Oh, poor devils," said Rowl. "Ah, there's the postman." A turnkey with a leather bag had just come through from the superintendent's office, which was not far away. Clary got up and went toward the crowd of which the man immediately became the center. After a moment, Rowl followed him, more because he snatched at anything which relieved the tedium of captivity than because he was any longer expecting a letter, and he waited, only half attending, on the outskirts of the group. To his surprise, he heard his name called and elbowed his way through the throng to find himself staring, with somewhat quickened pulses, at a letter bearing the Wanfield postmark. The handwriting was a lady's. He slipped back to his bench, his heart now beating really hard. The letter had, of course, been already opened, and it was from Miss Forrest. He read, "Dear Monsieur de Sablier, I do not know how to write to you. I know the truth now, in spite of the measures which have been used to keep me in the dark, and which did keep me in that condition until yesterday. No words of mine can express the shame, the burning indignation which fill me. I implore you to believe that I knew nothing of the duplicity which has sent you to such an unmerited captivity. I did not utter the lie which I find has been attributed to me. On the contrary, I gave that evening an exact recital of what had occurred in Farley Copse and of your gallant behavior there. Yet, from the sequel, you must have been convinced that I had shielded myself at your expense. Oh, believe me, such an idea never entered my mind. I would that it had never entered another's. I'm not, however, wasting my time in idle lamentations. I am determined that this intolerable injustice shall be repaired, and that you shall be liberated as soon as possible. I am writing to my father to ask him to use all his influence with the transport office. Mr. Bannister, on the strength of my evidence, has already communicated both with the commissioners and with Norman Cross. Meanwhile, also, I am seeing to it that all Wanfield knows how unjustly you have been punished. Mr. Bannister's relief is great to find that you are what he always thought you. Mr. Bentley and his daughters likewise. I do not think the two latter ever doubted it, nor did I, in my heart, though circumstances have been made to look very black against you. Strangely enough, it was your returning of Rasselas, a proceeding which cut me at the moment, as showing, I thought, your opinion of me, which led to the discovery of the truth. I have only this to ask of you, monsieur, that you will keep up your spirit and your patience, and believe that she who, as she sadly feels, is really responsible for the wrong which has been inflicted on you, is doing her utmost to procure its reparation. Your friend, Juliana Forrest. Postscript. Since you will hear it when you return, as I trust you will return, to Wanfield, I think it better to inform you now that my engagement is at an end. Rowl leant against the stockade and put his hand for a moment over his eyes. Now that what he had hoped for, and then ceased to hope for, had really happened, he felt almost bewildered. The ordeal was over. He was cleared, and his friends at Wanfield need no longer be ashamed of him. And Miss Forrest had never taught even that venial lie. A generous girl, to act, to write, as she had done. And since he had never for a moment believed that she would have sacrificed him knowingly, he had afterward regretted that, and piqued and sore as he was at being so unjustly used, he had given way, on leaving Wanfield, to a hasty and not very intelligible impulse, and thrust Rasselas into Lamont's hands without message. But now, it seemed, by its results, that his rather unworthy little action had been happily inspired. It was that, evidently, which had led her to make inquiries, to find out that Sir Francis. But here Rowl suddenly sat down on the bench, and Juliana's letter fluttered to the trodden earth of the prison enclosure. He had never fully thought out what, to a girl of the disposition which he attributed to Miss Forrest, might be the result of discovering that her betrothed had stooped to a baseness and a malignity really incredible in a gentleman. Well, now he knew what it had meant, and his breath was somewhat taken away by the marriage. He bent down, picked up the letter, and reread the postscript. There was no doubt of it. She had broken her marriage over this business. It had changed the course of her whole future life. As a Frenchman, accustomed to the extremely binding nature of a French betrothal and the difficulties of untying it, Raoul was a little horrified. Her discovery of the truth had certainly been bought at a heavy price. Now, his thought changed. And no price could be too heavy to save a woman of upright instincts from marrying a man capable of what Sir Francis Mulholland had shown himself capable of. Miss Forrest was, in the event, fortunate in her escape, and in this country, with her position and her look, she would have no lack of other suitors. And he doubted whether, from what he had seen, she would cry her eyes out for the lover whom she had so promptly dismissed. Yet, what an upheaval! He sat, with the letter in his hands, staring unseeingly at the hated contours of block number 8, not spending any thoughts, even thoughts of triumph, on the situation which must now be Mulholland's at Wanfield, but thinking solely of the girl. Yes, she would soon console herself with a better match, even some rich English lyric, no doubt. He gave a quick sigh, and put the letter carefully into his pocket. As he did so, Raoul saw the large form of Captain Dumont tacking toward him. Captain Dumont had a little of the pirate about his appearance, and was reported to display on emergency the class of temper and linguistic acquirements indispensable, no doubt, to one of his calling. But his usual bearing was that of the typically bluff and jovial seaman. He was one of the few officers there who were not broke paroles, as the Indienne, at least when captured, carried less than 14 guns. Her captain was not entitled to the privilege of parole, from which, indeed, he had self-sacrificingly cut himself off by throwing 3 overboard to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy. He now winked a blue eye set, as to its outer corner, amid innumerable creases, and said cheerfully, "A fine morning, Miss Sablier. You had a letter, a lucky dog. Oh, we're all in luck, for I have got it. So." He rolled on, repeating the wink. The unfinished sentence meant, "There's now nothing to keep us back from Monday's venture." But Rowl remained staring after him without moving or replying. He had quite forgotten that he was to escape the day after tomorrow. But to try to escape now would be insanity. More, it would be ingratitude. Yet, could he withdraw at the 11th hour? He got up at last from the bench, with a face vastly more troubled, for all the advent of Juliana Forrest's letter, than that with which he had watched his cloud an hour ago. That evening, in their close little sleeping apartment, he soon learnt from his comrades that he could not withdraw. The idea of the escape taking place without him was received by them with incredulity, with consternation, and then with an indignation which, in Captain Dumont's case, began very soon to warm into anger. And Clary was not conciliatory. "And so," he exclaimed, "you are content to wait while springs are pulled for you, or to wait indefinitely, perhaps forever. And what has come to you, de Sablier?" "Oh, I'm not afraid, if that is what you are thinking," retorted Raoul, firing up a little. "I've told you exactly the position I'm in. Was it so difficult to understand?" "No," said Dumont starkly. "It's not. Everyone for his own skin, and I'll call no man white-livered, unless he has given better cause for it than a natural wish to care for that. But There are 2 of us, and only 1 of you, Captain de Sablière, and I reckon 2 skins are worth more than 1. Or perhaps, seeing that you're a noble by birth, and we ain't, and you count it quits, me and Lieutenant Claret against you. Oh, you know I think nothing of the sort, Captain Dumont, answered Rowl hotly, and my birth has nothing to do with the matter. Oh, come, put in Claret pacifically. All this is off the point. I'm sure that if de Sablière thinks it over. How thinks it over? You don't need to. Why, I believe, damn my eyes, said Captain Dumont with an angry laugh, that neither of you youngsters has seen the real reason why we must have him, willing or unwilling. He's the only one of us who speaks English. And when, by the way in which both young men gazed blankly at him, the master of the Indienne saw that he was right, he slapped his knee with delight, and the threatened simoon blew over. I've got you there, young fellow, he said to the recalcitrant fugitive, and slapped him next. Oh, you can't back out when you know that Claret and I might just as well lie snug in our beds on Monday night as start through 2 English counties without you to do the parley. Yes, said Rowl, swallowing down with as good a grace as he could his irritation and disappointment. Yes, you've certainly got me there. I confess I never thought of that point. Of course, I will come, and willingly. Forget that I ever proposed anything else. Captain Dumont made a large gesture. It is already forgotten, he said magnanimously. And if you supply the lingo, de Sablière, I can supply a fist. He doubled that formidable object as he spoke. For which will not, I hope, be required, put in Claret quickly. The last weapon we want to employ, Captain, is violence. It is a very undiplomatic one in the hands of a fugitive. Oh, you wait, my lad, till you are in need of it, and you won't think it undiplomatic then. Well, this little matter being settled, I shall turn in. Claret lingered a moment by Rowl's bed as the latter also began to undress. You know, he said, in a low voice, it is really much better, for your own sake, to come with us. There have been other cases here for whom representations have been made to the Transport Board. Poor Mazar, for instance, he's been waiting nearly 3 years for their result. Rowl at this moment was pulling his shirt over his head and made no immediate answer. When he emerged, he said briefly, I've no doubt you're right. At any rate, I am coming with you. It was the question of a letter to Miss Forrest, not this imminent adventure, which chiefly engaged his thoughts next day. He could write and thank her, it was true, but he could not possibly say the thing he wanted to say, and that, ungrateful and foolish as he must appear, he was only carrying out this escape because he was already committed to it, for in a letter which would be read by the authorities, he could obviously make no reference, even vague, to a project of flight. In the end, he decided that he would wait to write until he was clear of Norman Cross. But it was plain that he would never see Juliana Forrest's face again. Reinstatement and release, such as she was working for, might have meant return to Wanfield, but successful escape meant leaving England altogether. And unsuccessful would mean Norman Cross forever, or removal to another prison, and perhaps to one of the big new depots in Scotland, Valleyfield or Perth. If he were retaken, he would certainly never be allowed out again on parole while his captivity lasted. Yet, the more he knew that it was impossible, the more keen was his desire to see her once more, not only to thank her from his heart for what she had done, not only to ask her to let him have back as a memento, really to be kept this time, that book which, indirectly, had been the cause of everything, but just for the sake of seeing her. Yes, he would like to talk to Juliana Forrest once again. Not by the stream, in the garden at Northover, where they had spoken once or twice, when the daffodils were out under the cedars. He wondered what flowers were blooming there now, how one knew nothing of flowers here. He would like to see the garden at Northover again, and now he never would. But at this point, Rowl pulled himself up. He, a soldier, regretting his captivity because it had been pleasant. He was indeed growing soft. Here, with a chance before him of breathing once more the air of France, he was sentimentally thinking of the charms of England, and of an Englishwoman. Oh, but surely he had the right to wish to thank her who had championed him, and the most fervid Anglophobe could not blame him for that desire. The chosen day, Monday, dawned at last. Rowl, waking early, looked in the dim light at his sleeping companions, and wondered where they would all be by next morning, if they were all three still alive. It was quite on the cards that one of them would get a bullet through the head, for the sentries were numerous, and armed with ball cartridge. It was a day of tension for all of them, and passed with cruel slowness. But it did pass. Dumont was unusually noisy and cheerful at supper, the more so that there was a rumor going about that the sentries were likely to be doubled that night in the vicinity of Caserne No. 4, the mutinous block, and he thought that in consequence the officers' quarters might be less closely guarded. But Rowl and Claret pointed out that the brigade major, who, and not the agent superintendent, was responsible for the military arrangements of the prison, a dual control not always of the most happy, had plenty of men to post as extra sentries, and if he did withdraw any from their corner of the depot, might not Marvin conceivably be one of them? If so, what of the rope for which he had made himself responsible? 5 hours later, when they were actually stealing in the dark along the ditch at the foot of the great wall, that was indeed the vital question. To Rowl, the foremost, feeling vainly along the brickwork for that indispensable adjunct, it seemed a cruel irony to be balked at the last stage of all, after having overcome their other difficulties. After having squeezed through the ventilator, climbed safely down the rickety pipe outside the caserne and over the pointed palisade, and after having avoided, more by luck than skill, the many sentries posted between it and the wall. And then, suddenly, his hand encountered what he sought. It was a good stout rope, knotted at intervals. He gave it a hard tug. It seemed securely fastened to something on the other side, and in a whisper, Rowl communicated this information to his comrades. It had been arranged that he was to go last, because, being the lightest, he would probably have least difficulty in swarming up the rope when its end was free, so he was first to steady it for his heavier companions. As the wall was only 9 feet high on its outer side, its greater height on the inner being due to the excavation of the fosse at its base, the fugitives, once up, could drop the distance. Dumont the sailor went first, and had soon arrived at the top, in spite of his corpulence. Yet, dark as the night was, his bulk seemed to Rowl to be plainly visible against the sky on the crest of the wall, and his arrival on the ground the other side was announced by a rather telltale thud. Claret followed quickly. His drop was inaudible. Then Rowl went up, the rope spinning as he climbed, straddled the wall, saw their upturned faces very dimly below him, and dropped lightly beside them. There was no sign of Marvin, nor at the moment of any of his comrades. Surely some sentries had been removed. Don't wait, whispered Rowl, his mouth at Claret's ear. I will overtake you in a moment. I promise not to leave the rope about. He hauled the slack over the wall to him, and, as the others vanished, stooped to feel in the darkness how the end was secured at its foot. He could easily have cut it off without ascertaining this, but in that case the knot, remaining, might perhaps bring complicity home to Marvin, a serious business for a sentry. Moreover, he had given his word. Oh, confound the fellow! Whatever was this he had fastened it to, right down in the grass at the base of the wall. The essential need of haste made Rowl's fingers clumsy. He would have to cut the rope, after all. Kneeling on one knee, he put his hand into his pocket for a small knife, which he had contrived to retain in spite of regulations, and the next instant was almost blinded by the glare of a suddenly opened lantern. Part 2, Chapter 2. The Shadow of Huntingdon Jail. Quote, I knew not to what condition we were doomed, nor could conjecture where would be the place of our captivity, or whence to draw any hope of deliverance. End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 38. The voice said, No, not today. Tomorrow, perhaps. I will let you know, sir. Streaks and circles of alternate light and darkness swirled incessantly under Rowl's closed lids. The light was of a reddish tinge. Not today. Not today. The words went on reverberating in his brain, but only as sounds. They had no meaning. Tomorrow, perhaps. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. What was tomorrow? And this sensation in his head, what was it? Had he always had it? But who was he himself, and where? A feeling as if he were floating upward brought the conviction of water and drowning. Yes, the crossing of the Gabora in the mist of a February morning before the battle. His horse must have been swept away, and the river had been in flood the previous day. But there was no water in his mouth or nostrils. He could breathe. How he could see. He found his eyes open and lay blinking. But he was not seeing what he expected. Sky, the cork trees, and the slope where Mendizábal's army lay. He saw whitewashed walls with high-set windows and beds, rows of beds, mostly empty. It was in a bed that he lay himself. A hospital, but where? Salamanca. He tried to lift his head a little in order to see more, but the pain, now localized at the back, became so acute that he drew a sharp breath and desisted, and involuntarily shut his eyes again. But after a moment he put up a hand to his head and found that something was tied round it. Or was that why it hurt so? He was inclined to think that it was. His mind began to grope backward, and gradually he came to the conclusion that he could not be in Spain, because he remembered coming to England, being at Wanfield, and then at Norman Cross. That was where he was then. But of recent events at Norman Cross he could recall nothing, since a certain supper when Dumont had been so hilarious. Was it possible that he himself had got drunk on that occasion, whenever it was? But there had been nothing to get drunk on, that he could remember. He was beginning to explore his head more carefully when he heard steps approaching him and opened his eyes once more. A lanky, sandy-haired young man came and stood looking down at him, and finally took hold of his wrist and felt his pulse. Well, how does your head feel now? He inquired after a moment. It hurts, answered Rowl. Well, why is that? And if I move it? Oh, there's a very good reason for its hurting, replied the young man. And don't you remember it? Rowl incautiously tried to shake his head on the pillow, and succeeded only too well. He gave an exclamation, but his mind continued to grope. Am I still at Norman Cross? He asked, gazing fixedly at his visitor. Yes, in the officers' hospital. Why? Oh, good Lord, you ask why? Because you were attempting to escape last night, and got a thundering knock on the head in doing so. You must possess a remarkably hard skull, or it would have cracked, said the lanky young man in a tone of admiration. Oh, perhaps I do, agreed Rowl unenthusiastically, and knit his brows in a fresh effort to remember. Escaping? Was I alone? I say, ejaculated the young man, have you genuinely forgotten? No, there were 2 others with me, and so far they've got away. I don't know their names, but they were your roommates at number 8. You're supposed to have got out by the ventilator. You do remember that, sure? No, replied Rowl. I remember nothing since supper last night. If it was last night. Perhaps that is as well, said the young man to himself. The tone struck Rowl, but he did not inquire into its meaning. Are you the doctor? He next asked. No, only his assistant. My name is Walker. But Dr. Walker was here himself a short time ago. You did not hear him speaking to Captain Hanwell, I suppose, for you seemed to be still unconscious then. They were at the foot of your bed, however. The superintendent himself, what was he doing here? Well, you see, he wants to ask you some questions. Commented Rowl wearily. Not much of it, is it, if I cannot remember anything? Well, that, of course, is what Dr. Walker said. At least, he said that you would not be fit to answer them today, though he did not, naturally, know that you had lost your memory. So the superintendent had to go away again. We have the hospital staff, you know, added Mr. Wanklin, smoothing his carroty locks with an air, are not technically under his control. We have our warrants from the sick and hurt board, not from the transport office. Then I hope the sick and hurt board will not allow Captain Hanwell to pester me with questions about the other two, because I shall tell him nothing. And my head aches, finished Rowl rather peevishly. I don't think it is about the other two that he wants to ask you questions, said Mr. Wanklin, and again his tone was so odd that Rowl this time was about to ask him what he meant, when a voice from a distant bed was heard summoning the budding surgeon, and he hurried off. And, in a little, Rowl, after vainly beating that blank brain of his, and realizing that the worst had happened, unsuccessful escape, drifted off into a comfortless sleep. When he woke again, it seemed by the light to be a good deal later. The pain in his head was much less, but still he could remember nothing of the actual escape. But now his mind was invaded by another subject, Miss Forrest's letter, and mingled with thoughts of that, came crowding in the often discussed details of that plan of escape which, evidently, they had put into practice last night. Yes, he remembered now the endless debates, the feverish preparations. Well, the other two had been lucky, but he had indeed defeated all Miss Forrest's plans for his welfare. And France, freedom, his parents, were all as far off as ever. An attendant came with some food, a little meat and potatoes, and placed it on a chair beside him, and Rowl realized that he was hungry. He fed himself with some difficulty, and though, if he moved his head cautiously, he no longer suffered such shoots and stabs of pain. And soon after the plate had been removed, he observed an individual whom he judged to be the surgeon himself walk down the ward and come to his bed. He was about 60, gray-haired, upright, somewhat severe-looking. He bent over Rowl, felt his pulse, looked into his eyes, and then sat down beside him. I understand that you speak English, Captain de Sablière. Yes, sir. Or is your head still troubling me? Not nearly so much. Very little, if I keep still. I'm glad to hear it. Mr. Wanklin tells me that you can remember nothing since supper last night. No, sir. Have you made the effort? Yes. But you can recall nothing of the circumstances of your escape? No, sir, nothing. You were found unconscious on the outer side of the wall. How did you come there? I've no recollection. I remember how I planned to surmount it, but I've no recollection of doing it, nor of what happened on the other side. The doctor was looking at him very searchingly. No, I suppose I was stunned by a blow, or did I fall? Or you were stunned by a blow from a musket. Eventually. It is a great pity that it did not happen at once. Rowl stared at him in bewilderment. What was this mystery at which Mr. Wanklyn, too, had hinted? Why do you say that, sir? He asked. It would be very kind to tell me exactly what happened on the other side of the wall, for I've not the slightest idea. I dare say you do not believe that, but it is true. Well, as a medical man, Monsieur de Sabliac, replied Dr. Walker gravely, I am inclined to believe that you are speaking the truth. It will, therefore, I'm afraid, be all the greater shock to learn that you are in danger of having to stand your trial for murder, and, but that you are obviously unfit for it, ought properly to be either in the black hole of this depot or in Huntington jail. Murder, gasped Rowl, like one suddenly immersed in water. Oh, in God's name, whose murder? Dr. Walker looked at him very keenly before replying. For the sentinels, he said at length. The sentinel who came up and discovered you. There was a struggle in which you bayoneted him, and were then felled yourself. For that is more probable than that he dealt you the blow first. At any rate, the man is in a most critical state, and if he dies... Oh, but it is impossible, exclaimed Rowl, horror-struck. Oh, I never bayoneted anyone, I swear it. He stopped. Oh, I thought that you did not remember anything, commented Dr. Walker dryly. And there was a long silence. Rowl, after staring at him as if he could not remove his gaze, put a hand to his head, and then, with a little sound like a groan, covered his eyes with it. And the color flared up hot in his face, and then died as suddenly away. Do you think, sir, that I can have done it and have forgotten? He inquired at last, in a strangely submissive voice, visibly very pale now that the hand was removed. To be perfectly frank with you, replied the doctor, leaning back in the chair in a somewhat judicial manner, I think there are great difficulties in the way of your having done it at all. It is highly improbable that you could have run the sentinel through after a blow from which 8 hours unconsciousness and partial loss of memory have ensued. On the other hand, if you did it before you received the blow, then it is almost equally inconceivable that the unfortunate man can have had sufficient strength to wrest the musket from you again and to deliver one so heavy. Oh, I know, of course, he went on, that you had 2 companions, and common sense would point to their having stabbed him and made off. Well, you must understand that no one witnessed the affray. When the other sentinels, attracted by this man's feeble cries, came up, they found you both lying there, you quite senseless, and he nearly so. But, unfortunately for you, Captain de Sabliac, the wounded man was able, before lapsing into an unconsciousness from which he may never emerge again, to make a fragmentary statement by which it appears that it is you, and not either of your companions, whom he charges with the deed. If he recovers sufficiently, this statement can be sifted, but if he dies, I'm afraid it will go hard with you. A second silence fell. Oh, this was worse than any mere recapture, worse than anything Rowl could have imagined. He gripped his hands together hard under the bedclothes. What would happen to me? You would have to stand your trial at Huntington Assizes. Killing and forgery, even in the case of military prisoners, come under the civil law. Then, if I were convicted, I should not be shot. No, said Dr. Walker gravely. You would not be shot. A little involuntary shudder ran over the young officer, and he turned his bandaged head away. The doctor bent forward and put a hand on his shoulder. You are not in Huntington jail yet, he said. Oh, this is not the moment that I should have chosen to break such serious news to a patient, but I thought it right to let you know how you stand, before Captain Hanwell questions you. I may as well warn you that he is, not unnaturally, extremely incensed, and the brigade major likewise, so much so, indeed, that I had considerable difficulty in saving you from the black hole, unconscious as you were. For you are no doubt aware that an officer caught trying to escape is liable to be treated exactly as one of the men. However, I would not have that, nor, I promise you, shall I allow you to be interrogated before I consider you fit for it, and, if possible, not until your memory has returned, which I think may occur at any moment now. You are much too kind to me, sir, said Rowl, moved. If I have done what the man says, and perhaps in a moment of madness I may have done it. His voice stuck in his throat. Oh, tut, tut, said Dr. Walker with a little smile. You see, I do not believe you did, not from any acquaintance with your character, but because I think it is physically impossible. Now, if your companions are recaptured, I'm sure they could not have done it, cried Rowl, alarmed. And they would never have been so foolish. I remember hearing Lieutenant Cleary strongly deprecating violence. You can remember something on behalf of a friend, can you? Remarked Dr. Walker, with a little note of appreciation in his tone. Still, theory and practice are two different things, and as one of you three must have done it, I think that you personally would be in a better position if they were recaptured, and I should pray for it if I were you. And he went away without giving Rowl time to reply. A murder. And they said he had done, or attempted, murder. And for all he knew, they might be right. Alternately panic-struck and unbelieving, Rowl spent the rest of that miserable day trying to batter down the closed door of memory. One or two of the other prisoners in the ward addressed him and condoled with him, but the place was unusually empty, and most of the occupied beds were too far away for conversation, and some of the occupants too ill. The successful escape of Dumont and Clary afforded general gratification, though it was considered very unfortunate that de Sablière had been left to pay the penalty of their assault on the sentry. For those who had overheard the doctor's opinion shared it, and one patient told Rowl that he had never seen a man who looked less capable of bayoneting anybody than he when he was carried in about midnight. How I thought the dead house was the proper place for you, concluded this observer. Oh, it must have come back in my sleep, sir, said Rowl with animation. When I woke this morning, I found I remembered everything. Oh, everything? Queried Dr. Walker, standing beside his bed. It was the following morning. How much does that include? Oh, not what the authorities think, replied the young man, almost cheerfully. The last thing, but one, that I remember is the flash of a lantern in my face, as I was kneeling at the foot of the wall and trying to, kneeling there. The last thing of all is a smashing blow on the back of my head before I had time to rise. I must have gone down like a log. And there it ends, though I dare say Captain Handel will not believe me. The surgeon looked down at the bright and candid eyes below the bandage. You will be able to put that to the test very shortly, he said. He is coming up here to interrogate you at 9:30, unless I pronounce you unfit for it. Oh, please let him come, sir, urged Rowl. I would rather get it over. If I may know two things. How the injured sentinel does, and whether my two companions have been recaptured. Well, the sentinel is still alive, and that is all one can say. No, your comrades have not been taken so far. And if you are not, one of them is guilty. Oh, not necessarily, said Rowl stoutly. Another sentinel may have bayoneted the poor man in the darkness, or he may have impaled himself on his own bayonet. Dr. Walker went away shaking his head, but Rowl had the temerity to submit this last hypothesis to Captain Handel when he, with the brigade major, came to interview him about an hour later. He meant it as a real contribution to the problem, but it seemed to be regarded as culpable persiflage, and he could see that it had done him no good in the eyes of the frowning authorities, and particularly in those of the military one. His emphatic denial that he had attacked the sentry, his asseveration that the latter, on the contrary, had put him out of action before he could even think of defending himself, was, as he had half expected, treated as negligible against the testimony of the injured man himself. And his case was not advanced by his refusal to give not only any information about his escaped comrade's probable whereabouts, which, to do them justice, the inquisitors seemed scarcely to expect, but about his supposed accomplice in the garrison either, as yet apparently undetected, in spite of the telltale rope. It was a rather exhausted offender who lay back on the pillows when this ordeal was over. But the unspeakably blessed relief of knowing that the blood of the unfortunate militiaman did not lie at his door had upborne him wonderfully, and he could not believe that, if the latter died, the supreme penalty would really be exacted from an innocent man, even in an enemy's country. So when Wanklyn approached him afterwards, his large, pale blue eyes full of a somewhat horrified interest, Rowl observed with a jocularity that was only 3 parts fittest. "So I suppose you feel that you are enjoying the privilege of looking at a condemned criminal, Mr. Wanklyn. If you really did not do it, de Sablière, you are in a devilish tight hole," responded this Job's comforter with so much of simple awe in his tone that one could not credit him with malice. "Are you of the opinion, then, that I should be in a more enviable position if I had done it?" Wanklyn scratched his chin. "No, not exactly. But if a man's got to swing, it might as well be for something." "Oh, I'd not thought of that," returned Rowl quite gravely. "Oh, in that case, I'd better—" "Oh, you know, I dare say," went on Wanklyn without letting him finish, "that about 5 years ago a prisoner was condemned at the assizes over a matter like this. Only it was a turnkey in his case, and he was hanged. Hanged he, too. It was quite an occasion, I believe. All the garrison under arms, all the prisoners made to be present. He was an officer as well, name of Boucher or something of the sort. Well, I hope that you will secure a good place when I afford Norman Cross a holiday of that kind," returned Rowl. "Then I gather that you will then harbor regret that I had no fun for my money, only a knock on the head." The good Wanklyn looked uncomfortable. "Oh, I don't think you ought to jest about it, de Sablière. Indeed I don't." "Oh, why? What else is there to do?" demanded Rowl. What, indeed, as he privately asked himself, when the other two, who had coerced him into flight by the plea of their dependence on his knowledge of English, were evidently getting on out there quite well without it, while he was left behind to bear the brunt of their ill usage of the sentry. How not like Rowl ill. The turn of affairs was just the fortune of war, but he could not be blind to its irony. Even if he escaped the dock, he would certainly be punished somehow, and never would he see Wanklyn again, however much that kind and generous girl exerted herself on his behalf. And by evening, he learned that the sentry, though still alive, had not made any different deposition about the identity of his assailant. Yes, it was an ironical, though hardly a mirth-provoking situation. Next morning, Rowl asked if he might get up, and having received permission to do so for a while in the afternoon, arose and dressed himself with the assistance of a French hospital orderly. He was obliged, of course, to resume his uniform. Too giddy to walk about, he contented himself with sitting in the stiff chair beside his bed, and observing the ward and its occupants, which he was now in a better position to do. He counted 18 beds each side, of which only 10 were filled. All but 2 of the patients, moreover, were asleep. Wanklyn was sitting beside one of them, and there was not a sound in the long room save the buzzing of an imprisoned bluebottle. Suddenly the big door of the ward was flung open, and an officer came briskly in, followed by a sergeant who, however, remained at the door. Rowl tried to stand up, and succeeded for a second, but was obliged to sit down again on his bed. His head swam so. The officer marched up to Wanklyn, now in the middle of the ward. As the prisoner de Sablière is not to be sent to Huntingdon Jail for the present, he may stay here on account of his condition, he announced. He is, of course, to be treated strictly as a prisoner, as a dangerous prisoner. Oh, but I can't be responsible for him, Captain, replied Mr. Wanklyn rather helplessly. Oh, your task will be made as light as possible, said the officer. A sergeant. The sergeant advanced, pulling from his tunic something that jangled. The officer made a gesture, and the other wheeled and came down between the beds to go. But Rowl, when he saw the handcuffs, started up and away until he was stopped by the chair and the wall. "I'll put them on," said the officer sharply, and, coming to the foot of the bed, addressed Rowl in person. "Oh, it is a concession, your being allowed to stay in hospital at all. But if you prefer the black hole, you've only to say so." "No," said Rowl faintly, and, overcome by a double nausea, he sat down on the bed again and held out his hands. A wave of scarlet ran over his colorless face as the manacles clicked into position about his wrists. The officer watched the sergeant lock them, and then, without more words, took himself off again, followed by his subordinate. Rowl sat stupidly on the side of his bed and watched them go. Then he looked down at his fettered hands. He remained so long in this posture that Wanklyn came up and touched him on the shoulder. "Lie down on your bed again," he counseled. "You'll get used to those things, and though it is a shame to put them on, you'll find that you're not by any means helpless even." Rowl raised the same rather stunned white face, and after a moment clumsily obeyed him, and lay there shivering, not with cold. Wanklyn fetched a blanket and spread it over him, and he lay huddled up, his hands clasping each other as though to assure himself that their close proximity was voluntary. The touch of those abhorred irons brought home to him what he was now, no longer a prisoner of war, but a criminal. He knew that there was a murmur of sympathy and indignation among the awakened occupants of the ward, but it did not help him. He was degraded in his own estimation. That he knew himself innocent did not help him either. In fact, a cold doubt of his innocence, of the value of his own memory, began to invade him. When Dr. Walker heard the news that evening, he looked grave. "Oh, I don't like that done in the hospital," he said, displeased. "But I'm afraid that in this case, it is the only alternative to the black hole." "Could I not," asked Rowl, with his eyes on the floor, "could I not have them taken off for part of the time? At night, perhaps, if I gave my word not to take advantage of it. I would give you my word of honor, sir." The elder man looked at him half pityingly, half sternly. "Oh, I have no power to accept it, Monsieur de Sablière. And have you a right to expect anyone to take it?" Whether or no he were referring to his lost estate as a reputed parole breaker, Rowl was utterly silenced by this rebuff, and when Dr. Walker had gone away, he rolled over and lay with his face hidden in the pillow. The others, respecting his mood, did not speak to him. His supper was taken away untouched. He was too sore in spirit to make the first attempt to eat in his shackles before the eyes of the other patients, ludicrous as he felt the spectacle must necessarily be. And as the evening wore on, he lay fighting down the mad impulse to try to tear the lengths apart by main force. It surged over him in waves, and he knew that if he gave way to it, he was lost. Yet when, hours later, he had got the better of it and sleep was beginning to come to him, he would move, and the constraint catch his wrists and rouse him afresh to the realization of what he wore. When he woke in the morning, he was lying on his back with his hands crossed on his breast after the fashion of a dead man, as he would really lie, perhaps, after he had made a spectacle, like that other officer, for Norman Cross. But the morning light had brought a hardening of resolution. He told himself that he had behaved like a child yesterday, like a guilty man, it might be. Whatever was coming on him, he would face with more courage than that. He forced himself to eat his breakfast, clumsily as he did it, and afterwards, observing to Wanklyn that, if he had to go as far as Huntingdon, it was time he learned to walk straight about the ward, rose up and essayed to do so. He staggered a little at first, but after a few turns found his head much steadier. Subdued congratulations greeted him from the other beds, and he acknowledged them. The doctor, too, when he came, approved of his perambulations. He also told him that the sentry was slightly better. Just before he left, he came up to Rowl, now sitting patiently by the side of his bed again, and asked him whether he would like to do a kind action. And when Rowl looked astonished at the request, said, walking meanwhile with him to a door at the end of the ward, "There's a poor young fellow in this little room who will never come out of hospital. I put him in here because it is quiet, but I'm afraid that it is sometimes too quiet for him. He's dying of consumption. Would you like to go in and see him? It pleases him to have visitors, when he is fit for it." Rowl looked down at his wrist. "But a visitor in handcuffs." "I've told him about that," said Dr. Walker. "Will you tell him also, please?" said Rowl very quietly, but looking the surgeon straight in the face, "that I'm not a burglar, for all that I was sent here as one." Dr. Walker evidently understood very well that this pronouncement was meant for him rather than for his patient. He gave a little dry smile. "Would it surprise you to hear that that has already been done, Captain de Sablière?" And before Rowl, rather taken aback, could answer, he had opened the door and the visitor went in. He forgot his fettered hands when he looked at the bed, at the young, virile, but inexpressibly wasted face on the pillow, whose lips gave him a faint and sweet smile like autumn sunshine, and spoke in a voice like the whisper of autumn leaves. "How kind of you to come. I have books. Monsieur le Docteur is so good to me, but not many visitors. Will you not sit down? I've heard of your misfortune, but I'm sure you—" A fit of coughing shook him. He made, or seemed to make, a motion towards a glass on the table, and Rowl gave it to him, with both hands. "You see how clever you are, monsieur," resumed the phantom voice. "Now, talk to me, if you will be so good, about yourself, about France. I'm from the Pyrenees, and you?" Soon they were deep in converse, and the thin fingers strayed over Rowl's irons. "You will be free? Yes, you will be free before very long. But I think I shall be free before you. I'm so much better, and when I'm well enough to travel, I'm going to be exchanged, and the cartel is already made out, and I shall see the mountains again, and the color of the gulf that tumble down them, and there is no water in the world like theirs, and the snows, and the little temple church at the room where I was born. Yes, I think I shall see them." He was seeing them now, his bright eyes fixed on the bare wall. When Rowl left him, he found tears in his eyes. That evening, as he sat on the side of his bed trying to nerve himself to another night of discomfort, Wanklyn came up to him with an air of great mystery. "Would you like to have those handcuffs off for the night, de Sablière?" "Would I like them mean, Mr. Wanklyn?" The young man sat down beside him on the bed, and showed in his palm a small, rusty key, at which Rowl stared uncomprehendingly. "I picked it up months ago. Had no idea what it was. Don't know why I kept it. I suddenly remembered it this afternoon, and it looks so much like the one the sergeant. Let me see. He bent over Raoul's wrists and inserted the key. It fitted. But Raoul drew his hands away. No, no, you will get into trouble if I'm found with these on, and I might be. Or not in the night, but come now. A guard might come from it then, or early in the morning, and it might be traced to you. But with a resolution which one would not have expected of him, Mr. Wanklyn seized the prisoner's hands again. The key resisted, turned, and the liberator wrenched one of the handcuffs open. "What have you done?" said Rowl, half aghast. "How diddled the transport office," replied Mr. Wanklyn in high glee. "Of course I should be glad if you would give me your word not to, you know." "Well, I swear not to move from this bed. You're a good fellow to trust me, Wanklyn." He cautiously stretched out his cramped arms. "Oh my God, it's like heaven. And what, the other one, too?" The bliss of being able to thrust a hand anywhere under the pillow that night, without the others having perforce to follow it. How excellent, foolish, good-hearted Wanklyn. Rowl fell asleep and dreamt that he was trying to induce that bold spirit to follow him out of the ventilator in number 8. But when his accomplice came to lock his fetters again next morning, his exhilaration seemed to have evaporated. In fact, he looked distinctly glum. "What is the matter?" asked Crowley, discreetly tendering him his wrists under the bedquilt. "Oh, I hope you've not been getting into trouble over this business already." "No," responded Mr. Wanklyn. "Nobody knows about it. There's nothing the matter." But Crowley, unconvinced, supposed that he had some private vexation, and the more so that, his mission accomplished, Mr. Wanklyn hurried away and did not come near him again. Dr. Walker was late in making his rounds that morning, and evidently pressed for time when he did appear. But, though he did not visit Raoul, the latter was aware of the rather strange glance which he cast upon him as he hurried out of the ward. When he was gone, it occurred to the prisoner to wonder, very uncomfortably, whether the sentry whose condition kept him in such continual uncertainty were worse. The orderlies, being prisoners themselves, would not know, and now Mr. Wanklyn, too, had vanished. Well, if the man died, he would hear it soon enough. And the sound of coughing coming through the door at the other end of the ward reminded him of Leonard Hill, the consumptor, friendly and lonely in there. So he went to pay him a visit and forget his own uneasiness. The dying man looked ghastly this morning, but he was more full of hope and plans than ever, and talked of the day, now so near, he said, when he should land in Brittany. For Morlaix was the cartel port of England, and of what route he should take to the Pyrenees. "And your affairs, monsieur, how do they go?" "I do not know," answered Rowl. "But I think I am not yet free of the shadow of Huntingdon jail." Leonard Hill shook his head with an air of knowledge. "Ah, you will not go to an English jail. I think of you. I see you on the sea. Yet I shall be free before you." At this moment, Mr. Wanklyn put his head into the room. "Oh, you are wanted, de Sablière. A guard has come to take you to the superintendent at once." "Oh, why?" asked Rowl. "Oh, I don't know," replied Mr. Wanklyn. "Oh, you do know," said Rowl to himself. "For the sentinel is worse, I suppose. Dead, perhaps." No, he's not dead," said Mr. Wanklyn with such haste that Rowl was certain he was lying. He got up and straightened himself. "Goodbye, Renfrew," he said gently, taking his hand. "Remember to greet France for me when you get to Morlaix." The brilliant, wasted smile followed him out into the ward where the corporal's escort was waiting for him. Part 2, Chapter 3. 2 Remorses. quote. She had lost her taste of pleasure and her ambition of excellence, and her mind, though forced into short excursions, always recurred to the image of a friend. End quote. Rasselas, chapter 35. Oh, hello, exclaimed Mr. Bentley, rustling the newspaper. Well, here are fine doings at Norman Cross. Oh, tch, tch. The other 3 persons in the room instantly put aside their occupations. That is to say, Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne, who was instructing Laetitia in the moves of chess, ceased to illustrate, and she to wrinkle her pretty forehead over the grasshopper-like progress of the knife, and Juliana, who had been doing nothing at all, roused herself. "Oh, listen, my dears," said Mr. Bentley, and read out. On Monday night last, 3 French officers made the most determined attempt, in which 2 of them succeeded, to escape from Yaxley Barracks. Having climbed out through a ventilator from the building in which they were confined, they scaled the stockade and, by means of a rope, supplied no doubt by an accomplice, surmounted the great wall. At this point, however, they were discovered by a sentinel of the West Kent militia, and an affray ensued, in which we regret to report that this valiant son of Mars was run through the body with his own bayonet, and left in a very serious condition. But as his assailant was also discovered insensible from a blow on the head, this shocking outrage will be punished as it deserves. It is to be hoped that the other 2 miscreants may also be captured, though so far they appear to have got away. Well, what a dreadful thing. Papa, said Laetitia very seriously, after a second or 2 of silence, I hope that Monsieur de Sablière was not one of those officers. Oh, now why, my dear Letty? Asked her parent, looking at her quizzically over the top of the sheet. Or why should you imagine that he would be? If young de Sablière has any sense, and I think he has plenty, he would not risk his chances in an escape now. Juliana was sitting very still on her low chair. Or perhaps he never got my letter, Mr. Bentley. Oh, dear me, Juliana, and now you. Oh, the riches of the female imagination. Well, you wrote, my dear, did you not, on Thursday in last week, and today is Friday. A letter might almost have reached Greenland in that time. But the newspaper says the attempt was made as long ago as last Monday night, does it not? Not even so, my dear, said her host kindly, for everyone at Northover was especially gentle with Juliana these last 10 days. Even so, you have no reason whatever to connect de Sablière with this attempt. Oh, I suppose there must be some hundreds of French officers at Norman Cross. Yes, I know that I'm foolish, said Juliana in a low voice. And Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne, who was watching her from his place by the chessboard, saw that her eyes had filled with tears. Would it not be possible to find out for certain, Bentley? He suggested. Bannister might have heard something. Oh, he might, agreed Mr. Bentley. He, too, was looking at Juliana. I was thinking of going into Wanfield this afternoon. I'll start at once and call on him. But we cannot have these dark fancies. He got up and patted Juliana's shoulder, and she caught his hand and gave it a little pressure. Most certainly Juliana needed, though she told herself that she did not deserve, all the sympathy which was hers at Northover. Although, and chiefly for Sir Francis's sake, the rupture of her engagement was not yet announced. Any awakened eye could see that she was not wearing her betrothal ring, and Sir Francis's absence from Mulholland Park, on urgent and unexplained affairs, had now lasted for over a week. And very soon the 1,000 tongues of rumour would all be busy with her and him, and he would be lucky if no connection were established between her dismissal of him and the just proclaimed innocence of Monsieur de Sablière. Had Juliana been less high of spirit than she was, she would have fled from Wanfield before her Northover visit was completed. But it was not, she felt, of what she had done now that she should be ashamed, but of what she had brought about by her conduct that March day. The honor of the man who had been wronged through her lay in her hands, and she did not mean to leave the place until she had some assurance that it was to be publicly cleared by his restoration to parole, of which, so far, nothing had been heard. Moreover, though she did not know how she could look him in the face, yet if Mr. Rowl were sent back to Wanfield within a reasonable time, she would wish to meet him. She could not be happy in her mind till she had heard from his own lips that he had forgiven her, and believed what she had said in her letter, and that she had not shielded herself at his expense. For Rasselas, lying on her dressing table, whispered to her daily that he suspected she had. And after this, her next task would be to placate her father, who, though in general extremely amenable, had exhibited by letter a very lively sense of his only daughter's waywardness, though he lamented, rather than condemned, the rupture with Mulholland, and promised to throw all his influence on the side of Mulholland's victim. Nothing but an attack of gout had prevented his arriving in person to remonstrate with Juliana, and only expressions of profound penitence from his erring offspring had deterred him. So he wrote, from sending his carriage to fetch her away at once from the locality where she had done so much mischief, and earned, or was about to earn, such uncomfortable notoriety. But Lord Falgrave knew in his heart, and Miss Juliana knew, too, that what really deterred him from this exhibition of paternal authority was the conviction that the carriage would have returned as empty as it started. Almost directly Mr. Bentley had gone, Letitia discovered that it was time for her to set off to the lodge to read to old Betty, as she had promised. Would Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne keep Miss Forrest company until she or her father returned? And most willingly, replied the old Frenchman, if Miss Forrest will be satisfied with me. For I cannot hope for the privilege of teaching her chess, for she knows it already. But perhaps she will accept my aunt round the garden. Restless and apprehensive, unnecessarily apprehensive, no doubt, Juliana was glad of the suggestion. She liked the Comte, though she was a trifle in awe of him. And since the 19th of March, she had felt a certain constraint in his presence, while being grateful to him for so unexpectedly abstaining from public condemnation of the unfortunate Mr. Rowl. Now, walking slowly along the terrace with her hand resting lightly on that meager arm, she suddenly realized not only that it was the first time they had been alone together since her return to Wanfield, but also that the foolish feeling of constraint was ebbing away, and that the old royalist had seen her and Monsieur de Sablière together by the stream that day was surely now a bond between them, not a barrier. She even had an impulse to speak to him about it, and when, having paced round the lawn, talking of nothing in particular, they reached the terrace again, she was not sorry when Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne said, apologetically, "Oh, but here I am chattering like an old magpie, while you are anxious about that report from Norman Cross. Well, you must forgive me, mademoiselle. I think I should not be so foolish if I had not a bad conscience," said Juliana dejectedly. And the Comte stopped. "Oh, mademoiselle, I wish mine were as clear as yours. Will you allow an old man the privilege of saying how much he admires your courage? I tread on delicate ground, I know, but I am so very old." And Juliana half laughed, and though her eyes were misty, she was aware that he knew the truth about her engagement. "I'm afraid that you're not very accurate, Monsieur le Comte. And I could not do anything else but what I've done latterly. But oh, if only I had not been so willful." "Willful?" asked Monsieur de Saint-Cézanne, raising his eyebrows. "You do not know the whole story. Only Mr. Bentley and Letitia know that. But as you saw Monsieur de Sablière and me together that day by the stream. I think I ought to tell you. Shall we sit on this seat? I dare say that when you saw us, however surprised you may have been, you thought at any rate it was a chance meeting. Monsieur de Saint-Suzanne seated himself beside her. Had I allowed myself to speculate about it, he said, with his fine smile, I should undoubtedly have thought so. Oh, but it was not, Comte. It was I who suggested to Monsieur de Sablière that he should be there that afternoon. I wanted to give him a book, and I returned to Mulholland Park that way on purpose. So, though I had no thought in my head but to show my independence. The words came out very low, and she studied the gravel. You see that it is I who am to blame for everything. Oh, but, my dear young lady, said the old man, though in a sense that may be true, and one that thinks the more highly of you for acknowledging it. Still, it was in no way your doing that this vagabond was in the little wood and tried to rob you, and so brought about Monsieur de Sablière's intervention. Oh, yes, it was, said Juliana, because if I had not acted so, the vagabond might have been there indeed, but I should not. I should have gone back the other way, and so Monsieur de Sablière would never have been involved in any difficulty. Well, said the Comte, we cannot all be wise when we are young, nor, even if we live to be old, can we foretell the consequences of our actions. A merciful dispensation, no doubt, of the good God. He had made it easy for Juliana to talk to him. Now she was looking at the austere profile with her own brows drawn together. There's one thing which has puzzled me so much, and that is how Monsieur de Sablière could have forgotten that you saw us together so short a time before the vagrant attacked me. When his word was doubted as to my being in the copse, why did he not say to Mr. Bannister, oh, but the Comte de Saint-Suzanne saw Miss Forrest near the copse just at that time. And you would have confirmed that if he had asked you, would you not? And the Comte inclined his head. Oh, certainly, if he had asked me. It seems so strange to have forgotten, repeated Juliana musingly. But the whole affair must have been so sudden, such a shock. Mr. Bannister has told me about that interview. Monsieur de Saint-Suzanne got up and began to examine the climbing rose just by them, whose new green promise was once more clothing the old bricks of Northover. He picked off a leaf and looked at it. And you are sure, mademoiselle, that he did forget? Juliana gazed up at him, astonished. What do you mean, Comte? Not, surely, that he believed you would refuse to bear out his statement? No, mademoiselle, I do not mean that. He dropped the leaf. It is a beautiful afternoon. Mr. Bentley cannot be back yet. Will you do me the honor to walk with me as far as my little cottage, Mademoiselle Juliana? I can answer your question better there. Oh yes, certainly I will come with you, if you wish, said Juliana, her surprise not lessened. The Comte's little house, it really was not more than a cottage, lay a bare 10 minutes from the gates of Northover. Juliana had been there once or twice with Laetitia to drink tea with the old woman, but she was struck afresh today with its impeccable orderliness. He had a wrinkled French servant, and perhaps that was the reason. But then the same order pervaded his stiff little garden, which was not in her hands. "Oh, Peggy, bring us your elderberry wine and some biscuits," said Monsieur de Saint-Suzanne, and in the spotless parlour conducted his guest, with his usual punctilious courtesy, to a comfortable chair. And Juliana, not to be outdone in the same quality, sipped some of the elderberry wine, which she disliked, and looked once more at the pastel portrait of the young man in uniform over the mantelpiece, cut down, as she had heard, by the Republican soldiers in Alsace, because he refused to ask quarter, and brought back, after Condé's victory, on the gun he had died to save. 20 years dead. He was very handsome, very gay, and a sword hung beneath him. And beneath that again, a little wreath of ink pen, so dry and shriveled that to Juliana they only emphasized what they commemorated. Her glance went thence to the tiny garden, with its beehives each exactly the same number of inches apart, and a sense of great sadness came over her. Monsieur de Saint-Susanne could have gone back years ago, had he wished, to his estates and revenues in France. But no, that would have involved recognizing and making his peace with the usurper. Rather than belie his convictions, he lived on year after year in exile, poverty, and cramped surroundings, his family dead, with nothing to look forward to except what seemed a very improbable desire on the part of his native land for the return of the Bourbons. A dead bough. The words came back to her, and the withered everlastings seemed to lend point to them. And yet, decay had its dignity. Meanwhile, the old man had been unlocking a writing table and came back with a letter. Here is the answer to your question, mademoiselle. I received this by an unknown hand from the jail the day that Monsieur de Sablière was taken thence to Norman Cross. You read French, I know. Juliana took the missive, written on coarse paper with an obviously superannuated pen, and in an unfamiliar foreign script. One glance at the signature, which sent the color to her cheeks, and she read, Wanfield Jail, March 21st, 1813. Monsieur le Comte, you saw me on Friday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, in converse with a certain lady on the banks of the stream. After she had left me at the bridge, the lady was attacked in Folly Copse by a tramp. I naturally rushed to her assistance, and had the good fortune to beat him off. To do this, I was obliged to go out of bounds for 10 minutes or so. For this technical breach of parole, and because it is asserted that, the lady in question being elsewhere at the time, the whole story is a fabrication, I am now in jail, and shall probably be sent to Norman Cross. Since I could have requested you, had I wished, to testify to this lady having been in my company that afternoon, shortly before the occurrence, and have not done so, you will understand why I ask you henceforward to forget the fact. The lady has now left the neighborhood, and, I'm sure, is ignorant of the turn events have taken. I do not wish her to be caused annoyance, nor would you, I'm certain, desire her name to be coupled, however innocently, with that of a man on whom you have publicly turned your back. Rowl Marie Amédée de Sablière. But, by the land which gave us both birth, I swear to you that I did not break my parole, except in a fashion that any man must have done for the moment. The color had left Juliana's face. Oh, he did not forget then. He went to prison for a scruple. He could have saved himself. Why did he do it? I was not ashamed of having met him. The Comte sat down beside her. Oh, my dear young lady, I am sure he was quite content to go to prison for a scruple of that sort. He is a gentleman, and it was not for him to mention having had the pleasure of a previous meeting with you, especially, may I say so now that you have honored me with your confidence, especially if it was not a chance meeting. He probably feared that that fact would come to light. No, my dear, you must not blame yourself unduly. You did quite right. Yet I, to my eternal regret, when I saw him marched off to jail, I did as he said. I turned my back upon it. But Juliana was too much occupied by her own self-reproach to feel Monsieur de Saint-Susanne's very keenly. She got up and walked rather agitatedly to the window, pulling out her handkerchief. The outlines of the beehives were no longer quite clear to her. I've heard you criticize Monsieur de Sablière because he served the Emperor, she said, dabbing surreptitiously at her eyes. You said such soldiers had no tradition and no breeding. How could anyone have behaved more honorably, more chivalrously than he has done? mademoiselle. I have told you that I am full of remorse. But I do not recede from my position, replied the inveterate old aristocrat. Monsieur de Sablière, 1 in 100 of the Emperor's officers, has breeding and tradition, and I ought to have known that they would tell, in spite of his environment. No, I could not have wished Felix. He glanced for a moment at the portrait, to have behaved otherwise. I shall welcome the day when I can beg Monsieur de Sablière's pardon for misjudging him. Oh, but, said Juliana, half irritably, one cannot count on that now. If he has escaped, or if by chance he is the recaptured officer. No, I will not believe that. It would be too much ill fortune. Let us return to Northover, monsieur, for Mr. Bentley may be back now. She picked up the cloak which she had let slide, and her host put it over her shoulders. But as he did so, a thought struck her, and she turned again. And then, all this time, ever since Monsieur de Sablière went to Norman Cross, indeed, you have known the truth about him, Monsieur de Saint-Suzanne. Yes, in confidence. It has been at once a reproach and a consolation to me. Oh, then I think you might have shared it with me before, said Miss Forrest rather indignantly. Oh, my dear Mademoiselle Juliana, I am not sure that I ought to have shown you that letter even now. Well, certainly I would not have done so before you admitted me into your confidence about the rendezvous. The whole point of the letter was to bid me forget the fact that I had seen you together, and I endeavored to do so. But, began Juliana, and then stopped, for there were steps in the little hall. Clavine's voice at the door announcing Monsieur Bentley, and that gentleman himself walking hastily in, too perturbed to be tactful. Oh, it's true, I'm sorry to say. That is, Bannister has heard that the recaptured officer came from Wanfield, which is sufficient to identify him as the Sablière. Oh, and the sentinel has died. A most unfortunate affair. I shall go to Yaxley tomorrow to see the boy and get the facts, and then to Peterborough or Huntingdon to interview an attorney. He must have the best possible legal assistance if the case goes to the assizes. Oh, of course, there will be an inquest first, and, oh, my dear Juliana, drink this. He caught up the half-empty wine glass as Juliana sank down, white as her dress, upon the nearest chair. She shook her head. Oh, I'm quite well, and if you go to Norman Cross tomorrow, I shall go with you. Oh, Mr. Bentley, he deliberately threw away. Oh, I can't. She could not, at any rate, finish. Part 2, Chapter 4. A better gift than Rasselas. Quote, the violence of war admits no distinction. The lance that is lifted at guilt and power will sometimes fall on innocence and gentleness. How little, said I, did I expect that yesterday it should have fallen upon me. End quote. Rasselas, Chapter 38. To visit a French officer prisoner, sir. That rests with the superintendent, Captain Handel. If you will drive round the barracks here, you will see the east gate of the prison before you, and the turnkey there will send your card in. I do not suppose there will be any difficulty. And then this group of buildings was only the barracks. The prison itself was behind that high and sacred wall, which they had already seen as they approached Norman Cross by the Great North Road. Mr. Bentley had alighted from the chaise and was talking to the officer who had appeared on their being stopped by a sentry, and Juliana, with her heavy heart, had moved nearer to the window to hear better. Mr. Bentley was now uttering thanks. Then she heard him say dubiously, I suppose you are not able to tell me, sir, how matters stand with Captain de Sablière, who is alleged to have fatally injured a sentinel. Oh, was that the fellow you had come to see? Exclaimed the soldier. By now he had evidently become aware of the fair face at the chaise window. You will be glad to hear, then, that as the sentinel has exonerated him. Both Mr. Bentley and Juliana gave an exclamation. Oh, but we understood that the sentinel had died. ejaculated the former in astonishment. Oh, he nearly did, I believe. But he is now on the road to recovery, and when, last night, his evidence was taken again, he retracted his former accusation against Captain de Sablière. He said, in fact, that he had never really made it, knowing that he had knocked de Sablière senseless at the outset. Here, the beautiful daughter at the chaise window showed signs of agitation. A lucky dog, this Frenchman. Mr. Bentley breathed an enormous sigh of relief. There's then no prospect of Monsieur de Sablière having to stand his trial. Oh, none at all, that I can see, responded the young man. A punishment of some sort, of course, he will get, for one can't encourage escaping, so. But nothing can done, I'm glad to say. He delicately emphasized the reason for his sympathetic attitude by a tiny bow in the direction of the chaise. I'm very greatly obliged to you, sir, said Mr. Bentley. You have relieved us from a terrible apprehension. Oh, what a relief. Juliana, my dear, we are to drive to the prison entrance yonder. I will walk. 'Tis not worth my re-entering. And he motioned the postilion forward, while Juliana leant back with her hands over her face. There followed a wait, which seemed to her endless, in the turnkey's lodge outside the east gate, till at last the messenger from the interior returned, and the turnkey announced to Mr. Bentley that Captain Hanwell would allow him to see the prisoner remained. As a matter of fact, he added, he's interviewing him himself at the moment. If you will follow this man, he'll take you across to the superintendent's office there. And so they went through the great gate, and were in the precincts of the prison to which she had sent her friend. Down a long, wide alley in front of her, Juliana saw the guns of the central blockhouse, and had an impression of penned humanity. But her mind was in such a turmoil that she was not conscious of much, except palisading and sentries everywhere, and over the palisading, the chimneyless, almost windowless casernes, roof after roof. Their guide bore to the left, across the open space dotted with sentry boxes, and stopped at a low building in a line with a stockade. It was of wood, like all the rest, and appeared to be an office, for within, at a high desk, was seated a clerk who incontinently withdrew himself into an inner room. Then, the turnkey likewise departing, Juliana was able at last to give vent to her relief. Oh, Mr. Bentley, let us thank God that the sentinel is alive, and has told the truth. Oh, indeed, my dear Juliana, I do, replied her companion with warmth. And our young friend may do the same, as I hope he does. If this man has died, I don't like to think what might have happened to the boy. But, Mr. Bentley, protested Juliana indignantly, how could any jury believe so monstrous a charge? Monstrous, my dear, queried Mr. Bentley gravely. It might very well have been true. What? Monsieur de Sablière bayonet a sentinel? Mr. Bentley shook his head. Oh, my dear child, an escaping prisoner is usually desperate. When a young man's blood is up, when his liberty is at stake. However, we need not pursue that subject, but thank God with all our hearts that de Sablière was saved from that extremity. Now, sit down and compose yourself after all this fatigue and anxiety. I understand that Captain Hanwell is interviewing a friend at this moment, or I suppose in this very building, no doubt to announce to him the favorable change in his circumstances. Juliana obediently sat down on a bench against the wall. Her eyes went round the unattractive room, where the paper was peeling from the walls. Through the window, she could see an empty enclosure, looking damp and sodden and inexpressibly dreary, and at the end of a paved path which ran diagonally from the rear of this little building, the gazelle, just like all the rest, which their guide had pointed out as the officers' quarters. This was the place to which she had sent him. But, oh, it might have been 1,000 times worse. It might have been Huntingdon jail on a capital charge, and that would have been her doing, with all the evidence to hand of his initial innocence, he would soon be released. Perhaps in time he would forget this unmerited captivity and who had brought it upon him. Would he return to Warnfield, or would he wish to return to Warnfield? Mr. Bentley, who was slowly pacing up and down with his hands behind his back, now came to a stop, listening, and a tramp of feet was heard outside. Juliana got up, her heart beating painfully. The steps halted at the door, which began to open. A voice which she did not recognize said in low tones of entreaty, "Oh, for God's sake, take these things off before I—" And another replied sharply, "Out of the question, in with you." Then the door swung wide, and there, standing just inside by the wall, not looking at them, was Rowl de Sablière in the grey trim uniform he had worn at the January ball. The door shut again. But it was not the Rowl of the ball, nor indeed he of the stream. For a moment, Juliana hardly knew him. His face was nearly as white as the unforeseen bandage round his head, and there were dark circles under his eyes as if from illness. But the expression on his face was one of shock, of flinching. The next second, Juliana realized also why he kept his arms in that unnatural position in front of him. His wrists were chained together, and she stifled a faint cry and shrank back in her corner. Mr. Bentley, who also had seemed for an instant disconcerted, now took a step or two towards the unmoving figure and held out his hand. "Oh, my dear de Sablière, I'm very glad to see you. I hope that bandage does not mean anything serious." And then he perceived why Rowl had made no motion to take his hand, and, biting his lip, he dropped it. "For we have come, my dear fellow," he began again, "Miss Forrest and I." "Oh, Miss Forrest!" exclaimed the young man. His pale face was suddenly tinged with color. He lifted his head sharply and saw her indeed in the background. The color deepened painfully, and then it ebbed in a rather startling manner. He made an inclination of the head in Juliana's direction, and after an instant said, still in that voice which seemed someone else's, but was now expressionless, "It is very kind of you, sir, and Miss Forrest. I can say goodbye." "Oh, say goodbye," ejaculated Mr. Bentley. "Well, what on earth do you mean? Well, don't stand there like that, my boy, but come and sit down and tell us the whole story. We have heard some of it, and that is to say, the end, and we are happy to know that." He did not finish. Rowl had broken into the most disconcerting and mirthless little laugh. "Oh, have you heard the end, Mr. Bentley? The real end?" "I think not, or you would hardly use the word happy." "Oh, surely you're not going to stand your trial, after all," exclaimed Mr. Bentley in alarm, and again his glance dwelt on the handcuffs. The bandaged head was shaking. "Oh, I wish to God I were. I might have had a chance then, for I did not bayonet the sentinel, Mr. Bentley, and I think I could have proved it. And even if I had been hanged for what I did not do, it would have been over quickly. Oh, but now, it will not be over quickly, for I'm going. They're sending me." He obviously found it hard to finish, and, gripping his fettered hands tightly together, bent his head and turned away. "Oh, my dear boy, where?" asked Mr. Bentley, putting a hand on his shoulder. Rowl swung round again. "Oh, to hell, Mr. Bentley, to the hulks at Plymouth." Juliana gave a sharp cry. "Oh, the hulks! Oh, good God!" said Mr. Bentley, horror-struck. Then he recovered himself. "Oh, but that is impossible. A mistake. You are an officer. An officer cannot be sent to the hulks. When an officer tries to escape, he loses the privileges of his rank," answered Rowl bitterly. "I'm going with a gang of mutineers, which is starting on Monday for Plymouth. The hawks at Chatham and Portsmouth being so overcrowded at present that even the Transport Board cannot cram in any more. How going with the common soldiers, mutineers, indeed, said Mr. Bentley. It is unheard of, outrageous. I shall see Captain Hanwell about it at once. Oh, I assure you that it is useless, Mr. Bentley. He will listen to nothing. He has, I understand, his orders. And it has happened before to officers. I've taken part in an escape with violence, and I'm the only one who can be punished. The other two, I'm glad to say, got away. And it was they, of course, who stabbed the sentinel. Oh, something must be done about this. Captain Hanwell must be reminded that you were wrongly sent here in the first instance. Has he not heard from the Transport Office on that point? Has he not received Bannister's letter? You know, don't you, that it has all come out, that Miss Forrest... Yes, I know, answered Rowl, and he looked briefly, painfully, towards Juliana. I received Miss Forrest's very kind letter. But has Captain Hanwell had no official communication? Persisted Mr. Bentley. That must be looked into. I shall see him myself. I will take no denial. How can I get at him? There's a clerk in there, I believe. Rowell's eyes dwelt on him in a manner which did not suggest that he had any great hopes from his intervention, as Mr. Bentley went to the inner door and knocked upon it and called. He said nothing, and never looked at Juliana during the short parley which ensued between that gentleman and the clerk whom he did indeed cause to emerge, and who agreed, not very willingly, to take him into Captain Hanwell's own office adjoining. And so, the next minute, the two were gone, and in the dull, disheartening little room were left the girl, looking like some strayed figure of spring, in her pretty white jaconet dress, and a cape of green silk slung by a cord across her shoulders, and the young hussar in his silver-grey bravery, with a bandage round his head, which might well have testified to a battlefield and its painful honors. But spring had horror and remorse in her gaze, and the handcuffs made a mockery of the uniform. Its wearer was plainly only too conscious of that fact. He stood rigid by the discolored wall, quite silent, his eyes on the floor, his fettered hands, as always, in front of him. He does not want even to look at me, thought Juliana, transfixed with misery. He hates me. He knows it is I who have brought him to this. Oh, he would rather be alone. But then, as if he had read her thoughts, the young man suddenly lifted his head, looked at her out of his dark, ringed eyes, and said, gently, "Oh, it is so kind of you to have come, and to have written like that, mademoiselle. But why do you not sit down? Is it too dusty in this horrible place? Oh, I wish he need not have been brought here." And from his tone, she felt sure that he meant not to see me like this. The conviction that he was humiliated by her presence, and that indeed, since she had come too late, it would have been kinder to have kept away, brimmed over the cup of her unhappiness, and she sank down on the bench that might or might not have been dusty, and put her hands over her face. "Oh, mademoiselle," came his voice, less unfamiliar and strained. "Oh, please do not be so distressed. Oh, this cannot be helped, and Mr. Bentley should not have exposed you to the... Oh, mon Dieu, are you crying? Oh, why should you cry?" Oh, what a question! Suddenly Juliana was sobbing helplessly, and then she knew that he was beside her, having moved for the first time from his self-chosen station. "Oh, please do not cry," he said, and his voice was now as she remembered it. "Oh, mademoiselle, if I am guilty of making you do that, I do indeed deserve heavy punishment." But that observation, and the attempt at lightness with which it was uttered, did nothing to check Juliana's tears. Rowl sat down on the bench beside her. "Oh, mademoiselle, de grâce, you make me so ashamed to have let you see that. that I do not like my sentence. Oh, you must try to forgive me. I had only just heard it, but now I'm a little braver. Mademoiselle. Juliana Forrest was not readily given to tears, and she found it proportionately difficult to control them now. Yet amid their mingled bitterness and relief, she felt that she really was distressing him and wasting the precious time as well. She made a great effort over herself and presently was drying her eyes. And the question which for 24 hours had tormented her came out, not free of reproach. If you had my letter, why did you try to escape? Yes, I do not wonder at your asking that, he said, with a little phantom smile. It was because I was already committed to the enterprise. I tried to withdraw, but my comrade needed me. I knew that my conduct would seem foolish, and worse, ungrateful. But indeed I was not ungrateful, mademoiselle, only unable to do otherwise. I meant to write to you when I got out. But now, I see you, and I can tell you myself how divinely kind and generous it was of you to write that letter. Oh, generous, when it is entirely my doing that you're in this situation. No, not yours, mademoiselle. And she colored and dropped her gaze. It rested on her ringless hand. Then she raised her eyes again bravely. Yes, mine, Monsieur de Sablière. You know it was my pique and self-will which brought about all this. Oh, mademoiselle, began Rowl, embarrassed, but she went on quickly. Oh, it is true, Monsieur de Sablière. Alas, I wish it were not. Oh, but I know that you might have saved yourself with Mr. Bannister if you had been willing to risk a possible slight injury to the reputation of a girl who did not deserve such consideration. Oh, why did you not call the Comte de Saint-Saëns as a witness to my whereabouts? Indeed, you were too chivalrous. I'd no wish to hide the fact that we met that day by the stream. Had I known what hung on it, I would have blazoned it abroad. Mademoiselle, said the young man. His eyes thanked her. But it was not so simple as that. It was not that, by calling the Comte, I so much feared for you the revelation of our very harmless little promenade by the stream, as that, for all I knew, you yourself had, and were not to be blamed for it if it seemed good to you. You yourself really had told a certain person that you had returned by the high road, and had said nothing about falling props. I know now that it was not so, but I could not be sure of it then. So how could I call a witness who might prove you a liar? And he went to prison rather than run the risk of that. Oh, but of course, mademoiselle. He seemed surprised at the question. How could I repay your kindness by doing such a thing? Kindness, said Juliana in a low voice. Her lip trembled a little. She looked at him sitting there beside her, pale, injured, fettered. Her victim, and yet how immeasurably above her. He was her judge. The thought of her rejected gift returned sharply upon her. Oh, Monsieur de Sablière, I implore you to say that you believe I did not lie. He turned his bandaged head quickly. Oh, mademoiselle, what are you thinking of me? And did you not tell me so in your letter? That was enough for me. It is I who should be imploring you for pardon, that I ever thought you might have done so. But I never, for one moment, thought that you had done it knowing that I was in difficulties. Oh, never, never. And I begin to think now, he added on a sudden half-whimsical note, that since it distresses me so, I'd better not have chosen the hospitality of Captain Rowl. But it seemed the right course to take then. Oh, that she should be driving him to apologize for his heroism and his chivalry was more intolerable than the other position. She sprang up. Oh, you think I'm blaming you, she exclaimed. Oh, Monsieur de Sablière, you must hate the very sight of me. Oh, that, said Rowl as he rose, with something of his old easy, buoyant manner, is not very probable, even if I were going to be hanged for what you choose to imagine that you are doing, shagged Mademoiselle Forrest. And hanging, as you know, is not to be my fate. As for the hall, perhaps I shall not stay there very long. An old ship and some water. The opening of the door stopped him. It was Mr. Bentley, unsuccessful, as was evident from his expression. "It is of no use," he said dejectedly. "Captain Hanwell expresses regrets, but he has definite orders from London. And he has received Mr. Bannister's letter. I do not see what further plea can be brought to bear on it." "Oh, but Mr. Bentley," objected Juliana, "evidently Captain Hanwell cannot realize that the initial injustice of Monsieur de Sablière's having been sent here at all is being pressed upon the commissioners at this moment by my father and others. He surely has sufficient discretionary powers allowed him to wait a few days and see the result. I shall go and interview him myself." "Oh, my dear, I am really afraid," began Mr. Bentley. "Oh, do not go, I beg of you, mademoiselle," said Rowl, looking rather startled. "Even to you, I do not think he will listen. I assure you, I was not done myself." He smiled, half wryly, at the recollection. "Yes, I must see him," said Juliana firmly. "My father's name should have some weight. If Mr. Bentley did not actually ask for a little delay." "No, my dear, I can't remember that I urged that. I argued rather from the premises you mentioned, that Monsieur de Sablière ought never to have been sent here at all." "Then I've a sufficiently good reason for an interview," said Miss Forrest, "and I shall not be asking for too much. Will you take me to Captain Hanwell, Mr. Bentley?" "I shall see you again to take farewell, Monsieur de Sablière." "God bless you, mademoiselle," he answered. "But if they should have taken me away—" Juliana held out her hand, with a look which proclaimed, as plainly as speech, not what she thought of herself and her part in this calamity, but what she thought of his. Rather dazzled, Rowl took the little hand, as best he could, in both his own, and put his lips to it. In his own office, where there was no wallpaper to peel, so lined were the walls with pigeonholes, at a large table heaped with docketed papers and files, Captain William Hanwell, R.N., had now turned from the de Sablière affair, which, as far as he was concerned, he considered closed, to his correspondence with the Transport Board on a subject about which that body was just as inquisitorial, namely, the undue consumption and the ultimate fate of the birch brooms in use at Norman Cross. Captain Hanwell was fairly new to his present duties, having succeeded the late agent, the popular Captain Draper, just 2 months before. Like nearly all in his position, he was a naval official, the Transport Office being a branch of the Admiralty. The successful escape of Dumont and Clery, the attack on the sentry, a certain amount of friction with General Williams and Brigade Major Mills, the discovery of the complicity of the man Marvin, and some very stiff letters from the commissioners about the affair, were not a particularly auspicious prelude to his 3rd month of office, and it would have been surprising if he had been sympathetic to de Sablière when he had had him before him just now. The culprit had been so stunned by his sentence that it had taken the news of Marvin's prospective 500 lashes to rouse him. He had then pleaded hard for the unfortunate militiaman, and was told that he should have considered the probable results to the latter before subordinating him. Yet Captain Hanwell, if stern, was neither vindictive nor unjust. He had every right to be angry, and he was only carrying out his instructions. He had just taken up his pen to assure the commissioners that the old broom stumps should be received back into store, as they ordered, when there was a knock at the door. It opened, and there came in a beautiful, tall girl, simply and elegantly dressed, accompanied by the oldest gentleman he had already interviewed. "Miss Juliana Forrest, Lord Falgrave's daughter, desires the favour of a word with you, sir," said this Mr. Bentley, and there was nothing for Captain Hanwell to do but to jump up and fetch her a chair, and exhibit all the attention proper from a naval officer to a member of the fair sex. But when this attractive intruder reopened the question of the fate of de Sablière, he presented an immovable front. "Oh, I do not for a moment doubt your testimony, Miss Forrest," he assured her when she referred to the episode of the train. "In substance, it is already familiar to me, you know, from a letter which I received from the agent at Wanfield. But you see, do you not, that to adjudicate on Captain de Sablière's past innocence or guilt never came within my province. He was sent to me as a broke parole, and as a broke parole I received him. And that past guilt or innocence does not, unfortunately, at all affect the question of the grave misdemeanor he has committed since. But all I ask for, sir," replied Juliana, "is a few days' delay, only that you should not send him to the hulks on Monday. My father and my cousin, and the Earl of Chichester, are both interesting themselves in this case. It is impossible that nothing should come of the representations to the transport office. Again, I do not doubt your word, Miss Forrest, but I must point out that there is no trace of this in the instructions I just received from the commissioners. Oh, but by Monday you may well receive different instructions," pleaded Miss Forrest, a bright spot on either cheek. "Oh, this place is not very far from London." "For 76 miles, returned Captain Hanwell, with precision. "If I hear from the board in Captain de Sablière's favor on Monday, you may rest assured, Miss Forrest, that he will not go with a draft. More than that I cannot possibly promise." "For you could not, then, yourself write to the board," suggested Juliana, "and point out that representations are being made to them." She paused suggestively, and Captain Hanwell almost permitted himself a smile. And the lady was very persistent to her Frenchman. It occurred to him to wonder whether Viscount Falkland, for his part, were being quite so assiduous in London. "They must themselves be aware of it, madam," he replied, "if such influential pressure as his lordship's and the Earl of Chichester's is being brought to bear on them. And to inform them that representations are also being made to me, who cannot move in the matter without their orders, would, I think, prejudice rather than advantage the prisoner's case." "Oh, I think Captain Hanwell is right there, my dear," observed Mr. Bentley, who had wisely left Juliana to conduct this duel by herself. "But I'm sure that you will hear from him," reiterated Miss Forrest with feminine persistence. "Oh, if you could only keep him back a few days." "Impossible," replied Captain Hanwell rather shortly. "In the first place, I should be disobeying the plain orders of the board just transmitted to me. In the second, were I willing to disobey them on the chance of the arrival of a counter-order, I should be obliged, if no such order came, to incur the expense of a separate escort for de Sablière. And you must forgive me if I sound unduly harsh. Apart from my orders, I cannot personally see why he, who has actually broken prison and been concerned in the shedding of blood, should suffer a less punishment than the misguided ruffians in block number 4, who have done neither." For it was, evidently, hopeless. He did not want him to be reprieved. "And how will Captain de Sablière go to Plymouth?" "Well, he will march with the rest, Miss Forrest." "A march from Huntingdonshire to the extreme limit of Devonshire? Our prisoners are only required to do an average 12 miles a day. Well, then it will take weeks. What is a healthy enough life in fine weather? The journey will probably be preferable to what he finds when he arrives, the poor boy," put in Mr. Bentley sadly. "Yes, I think you are right there," agreed Captain Hanwell with a certain grimness. And he rose to indicate the end of the interview. "You think me hard, I'm sure, Miss Forrest," he said, as he went to open the door for her. "But you must remember that an unfortunate sentinel has all but lost his life over this business, and another has to be flogged. pending any reconsideration of their order by the commissioners. De Sabliac must take his punishment, too. And I should not be doing you a kindness if I held out any hope of its being remitted now. I am sorry. Good afternoon. He bowed, and they found themselves outside in the damp. Oh, what a hard, cruel man, said Juliana. And what have I done? What have I done? You have done your best, my dear, said Mr. Bentley, patting her arm. You must not be morbid over it. The terrible pity is that the boy tried to escape, especially after getting your letter. Oh, I can't understand his thieving. That was not your fault. Yes, everything is my fault, because I sent him here, said the girl. He did not want to escape, but the others needed him, it appears. Struggling for her composure, she glanced at the door of the other office. The sentry was still on guard outside. And now we have to tell him that there's no hope of remission. Well, I'll do it, my child, said Mr. Bentley compassionately. I think you had better not see him again, since it distresses you so. Oh no, replied Juliana instantly. I must see him again. And I think, she added, that I would rather see him alone. Oh, very well, my dear. I will wait for you out here. Rowl de Sabliac was sitting on the bench in the far corner, his elbows on his knees, his face hidden in his hands. He did not seem to have heard the door open, for he made no movement, and Juliana was able to stand near it a moment till she was sure she could control her voice. For it was only for her sake, then, that he had shown that cheerfulness. And when he thought he was alone, she went and sat down beside him. Even then, he did not move. Oh, Monsieur de Sabliac, it is of no use. He will not consent to any delay. But if the transport office do not relent, not a day shall pass that I do not work for your release. Not a day. I shall communicate with you at Plymouth and keep you informed. Even if my father and my cousin can do nothing, I shall not rest, I swear it, until I have you out, somehow. He murmured something scarcely audible about his not being worth so much trouble, and the lifeless tone seemed to indicate that he had little faith in her efforts. Oh, small wonder, when already, as she now noticed, his wrists were chafed by those horrible handcuffs. Her eyes filled. Say that you trust me, she said in a breaking voice, or I cannot bear it. And that brought his hands down, and quickly she caught them as they came. Do you trust me? Me who have harmed you so? He tried to smile at her, and as far as his mouth went, the result was not unsatisfactory. But out of his eyes, not to be hidden now, looked something that had no kinship with smile. I do, he replied firmly and earnestly. I believe every word you say. I doubt if you can do anything more, but I would trust you with my life, and I shall think of you every day, as you were at Wanfield, and still more, as you have been here. He did trust her, he did believe, and she was all he had to look to, in the horrible existence to which he was going, in the pit into which she had pushed him, which he dreaded so much that he had not been able to hide his momentary failure of courage. The tide of pity and remorse, which every second was rising higher in her heart, was swelled by another stream, whose existence in herself Juliana Forrest had never guessed, that fount which almost every woman has of maternal and protective for a man. And so she gave him a last and more beautiful remembrance of her, for as he looked at her with those betraying eyes, his manacled wrists clasped round by her compassionate fingers, she suddenly leant towards him and kissed him on the forehead, low down, because of the bandage, almost between the eyes. Kissed him as his mother might have done. And before he had recovered from the wonder and the surprise of it, she was gone.